6/2/1943 11:28.
What if the memory that had followed a person for nearly 40 years did not belong to them at all? The image arrived in fragments, never in full. A hand-stitched face glistening under studio light. The faint crackle of a cathode ray tube warming in a dark room. A voice so low it seemed to come not from the television speaker but from the walls themselves. For thousands of people across eastern Germany, the memory had the same shape. Winter of 1988. A children's puppet program shown too late for children to be awake. A grotesque figure with one melted cheek and glassy eyes, and whispers, warnings, numbers, a sentence no two witnesses repeated in exactly the same way, except for one detail. They all remembered being afraid before they understood why. By itself, that would have sounded like folklore. A rumor born from nostalgia, then sharpened by the internet into certainty. But the older Eleanor Weiss became, the less she trusted the clean separation between rumor and record. She had spent 23 years working among recorded things, voices captured on magnetic tape, grainy images sealed inside oxidizing reels, forgotten announcements stored in climate-controlled darkness. She knew how memory decayed. She knew how easily people borrowed details from each other and mistook them for their own. Yet she also knew something else. Archives lied more elegantly than people did. On a Tuesday evening in late November, long after most of the building had emptied, Elena stood alone in Studio Archive Nord, the central audiovisual archive of the national network in Berlin. The old wing of the building had once belonged to a state broadcaster with a different flag, a different anthem, and a different understanding of truth. Renovation had modernized the corridors, but not enough to erase their original severity. The ceilings remained too low in some sections and too high in others. Doors were heavy, windows were narrow, the fluorescent lights hummed as if they were holding their breath. She was 45 now, with the controlled posture of a woman who had spent her life handling fragile objects and fragile people. Her dark hair, cut just above the shoulders, was beginning to show silver at the temples. She wore reading glasses low on her nose and moved through the archive with an economy that younger staff sometimes mistook for coldness. In truth, Eleanor was not cold. She was careful. There was a difference. That evening, she had stayed late to verify a disputed catalogue entry from a regional transfer, one of dozens of anonymous crates that still arrived from municipal depots, decommissioned studios, or estates of former technicians. Most contained exactly what one would expect. Weather reports, local theatre broadcasts, children's choirs, election coverage, sports summaries, New Year specials preserved by chance rather than importance. But one box had been different. It was unmarked except for a fading inventory tag from Leipzig. The cardboard smelled of damp plaster and old tobacco. Inside, beneath a loose coil of cable and two rusted splicing tools, lay a puppet. At first, Elena thought it was broken studio scrap. Then she took hold of it and felt the weight. The face had once been painted cream, but heat had distorted it into an expression no designer could have intended. One eye had collapsed inward and hardened into a glossy black pit. The other bulged behind a cracked lens. Its mouth, stitched from red felt, had curled on one side as if the material had softened and slid before cooling again. The little coat it wore was made of striped wool, singed along one sleeve. There was no label, no production stamp, no storage note, just the puppet. Eleanor had carried it to her desk without calling anyone. She could not later explain why. Perhaps because she had been alone. Perhaps because the thing produced in her a reaction so old and so immediate that it bypassed thought entirely. The sensation was not recognition, not at first. It was physical. A tightening behind the ribs. A sourness at the back of the tongue. The strange certainty that the room had grown quieter in order to listen. Outside the narrow archive windows, Berlin had already turned to black glass and reflected streetlights. Rain slid down the panes in restless threads. Somewhere in the building, a lift door opened and closed, then did not open again. She told herself to proceed professionally, photograph the object, log the condition, trace the shipment record. But when she switched on the desk lamp and angled the beam across the puppet's face, something inside her recoiled. Not because it was ugly, because she had seen it before. The thought arrived with immediate resistance. No, she told herself, Impossible. Childhood memory was a treacherous editor. It cut, stitched, and replaced. People saw one old photograph and rebuilt an entire decade around it. Yet her hands remained still on the desk. The puppet's half-melted cheek reflected the light in a way that tugged at a deeper image. A winter sitting room in Leipzig, curtains drawn before evening had fully fallen, the orange blink of a heater coil, the smell of boiled potatoes from the kitchen, and a television set humming with that peculiar electrical warmth that old CRT glass gave off when touched too closely. Elena had been 7, perhaps 8. Her mother had been washing dishes, her father had not yet come home. And on the screen there had been... what? Not a program she understood, not a cartoon. Something slower, something that stared too long. She stepped back from the desk so abruptly that the chair wheels squealed against the floor. A knock came at the archive door. Elena turned, pulse unexpectedly hard in her throat. For a moment she saw only the reflection of fluorescent light in the small wire window. Then the door opened inward, and a security guard leaned in, apologetic. "Dr. Weiss, there's someone downstairs asking for you." She checked the wall clock. It was nearly 9. "Who?" The guard hesitated. "An older man. Says it's urgent. He wouldn't leave his name." Elena glanced once at the puppet, then reached for her coat. The reception area was almost dark, lit only by a bank of low lamps and the pale glow of the entrance monitors. Rain had intensified, tapping at the glass doors. The man waiting there looked as though the weather had soaked through more than his clothes. He sat slumped in a molded plastic chair, one hand pressed flat against his chest, the other holding a cloth shopping bag with both possessiveness and exhaustion. He was in his late 70s, maybe older, thin to the point of translucence, with a face that seemed to have been folded by long habit into secrecy. When Elena approached, he raised his head with visible effort. "You're the archivist," he said. His voice had the dry scrape of paper dragged over wood. "Chief archivist," Elena answered. "If this concerns a donation, you should arrange it through acquisitions in the morning." The old man gave something like a smile. "No, morning is too late for this kind of thing." He reached into the bag and drew out another object wrapped in yellowing newspaper. His fingers trembled so violently that Elena instinctively moved to help, but he jerked the bundle away until he had unwrapped it himself. It was a puppet hand, just the hand, detached at the wrist. The felt skin had been blackened. 3 fingers were fused together as if exposed to severe heat. Around one finger was looped a fragment of fine copper wire. The old man placed it in Elena's hands and closed her fingers around it before she could refuse. "I took it," he said, "from the bunker, the night the wall fell. We thought everyone had run. We thought it was abandoned." He swallowed with difficulty, eyes fixed not on her face, but somewhere over her shoulder. It was not abandoned. It was still working. The lobby seemed to contract. Even the rain sounded farther away. "What bunker?" Elena asked. "The station they said did not exist anymore." He breathed in sharply, as if the sentence itself hurt him. "The one in Leipzig. The one under the tower. Children remember the program, don't they? They remember it and nobody can prove it. That's how you know it was real." Elena's mouth had gone dry. She knew with sudden clarity what he was referring to before he said it. "What program?" The old man looked at her then, directly, and in his expression there was not madness but recognition. That was worse. "You know the title," he whispered. And she did. Not because it was written anywhere, not because she had heard it recently. It came from the same buried place as the room, the curtains, the heater coil, the glow of the screen. She heard herself say the words before she decided to speak them. Broadcast from a missing station. The old man's eyes filled with something like relief. He nodded once. Then his body seemed to empty all at once. He folded forward in the chair, newspaper slipping from his lap, breath leaving him in a shallow rattle that made the security guard shout for an ambulance. In the chaos that followed, Elena barely moved. She stood in the reception light with the burned puppet hand in one palm, and in the other, the old certainty that something long buried had just opened its eyes. Because while the medics worked and the rain kept beating softly at the doors, a detail rose from memory with such force that it made her knees weak. She did not only remember the puppet, she remembered the tower it had supposedly come from. And according to every official record in the archive upstairs, that tower had been dismantled 3 years before anyone claimed to have seen the program at all. The following morning began with the sound of carts rolling over polished concrete and the smell of coffee drifting up through the atrium from the staff cafe below. By 8:30, Studio Archive Nord had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Assistants logged incoming transfers. A restoration technician argued quietly with a software vendor over corrupted metadata. A researcher from Hamburg waited for permission to access a set of regional election tapes. Printers woke, hummed, and fed paper through their trays with bureaucratic indifference. Nothing in the building suggested that a man had collapsed in the lobby less than 12 hours earlier while placing a charred puppet hand into Elena Weiss's palm. That was the most disturbing part. Mysteries, in Elena's experience, did not announce themselves with thunderstorms or meaningful silences. They entered quietly and then insisted on remaining while everything else continued as normal. The world did not stop to acknowledge that a seam had opened beneath it. Phones still rang, deadlines still arrived, people still asked where the quarterly preservation report had been saved. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor was already in her office on the archive's upper level, her door half open, her desk lamp on, despite the thin winter light coming through the narrow window. She had slept barely 3 hours. Her apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, usually a place of disciplined calm, had offered no refuge. She had showered, dressed, boiled water for tea, and sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank wall, while the old man's final words repeated themselves with the dull persistence of a clock. The one under the tower. By dawn, she had stopped trying to decide whether she believed him. Belief, she knew, was too crude a tool. The only useful question was whether anything he said could be tested. That was how she had built her life. There had been a time, in the years immediately after reunification, when Elena thought she might become a historian. She had studied media culture instead, then drifted toward preservation, drawn by the unromantic dignity of keeping things from vanishing. History, she learned early, was full of people who wanted to tell a convincing story. Archives were less sentimental. They held the residue after performance. Time codes, signal noise, maintenance records, transmission logs, studio invoices. The stubborn paperwork of systems that did not know they were participating in future narratives. If she trusted anything, she trusted process. And yet process had failed to steady her all morning. The grotesque puppet from the crate now lay sealed in a temporary evidence box in her office cabinet, photographed but not yet catalogued. The burnt puppet hand, which she had turned over to building security only after documenting its condition herself, was being held until police decided whether there was any reason to classify the old man's visit as part of an active investigation. As far as Elena knew, he was alive, but barely. One of the medics had said cardiac event in the neutral tone professionals used when they did not want to speculate in front of civilians. No identity had yet been confirmed. She had called the hospital at 7. They told her nothing. Now, seated before her computer, she opened the archive's internal database and began to move through familiar systems with the exactness of ritual. She searched decommissioned broadcast infrastructure in Saxony. She searched former regional relay towers in Leipzig. She searched dismantlement reports cross-listed with the Central Technical Registry. One file after another opened cleanly on the screen. The tower was there. She found it in less than 6 minutes. Object ID LZB-17. Regional Analog Broadcast Tower, northwestern sector of Leipzig. Commissioned in 1969. Maintenance issues throughout the early 1980s. Structural corrosion. Full dismantlement authorized in May 1985. Final deconstruction completed in October of that year. Supporting documentation included procurement signatures, demolition invoices, and a photograph showing only an empty concrete base behind fencing and winter brush. Elena enlarged the image until the grain broke apart. No tower, no dispute. She leaned back and removed her glasses, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Normally, that would have been the end of it. A false memory could survive anything except contact with records. If an entire generation insisted they had seen a program broadcast from a structure already gone, then the explanation was psychological, cultural, or folkloric, disturbing perhaps, but not mysterious, except that she had the old man's object. and she had her own memory. She hated admitting that second part, even privately, especially privately. For years, Elena had treated her childhood like a room whose door remained closed unless absolutely necessary. She had not suffered in any dramatic way. No scandal, no arrest, no visible family rupture. Her father had been an electrical engineer for the municipal utility in Leipzig. Her mother had taught literature at a polytechnic preparatory school. They had endured the East German years as millions did, with caution, a narrow emotional vocabulary, and a talent for not saying everything aloud. After reunification, they adapted, awkwardly and without nostalgia. Her father died in 2009. Her mother, now 78, lived alone outside Dresden and preferred to discuss weather, prices, and joint pain rather than the political texture of the world they had once inhabited. What Elena carried from childhood was harder to name. Not trauma exactly, more like static, a chronic distrust of certainty, a sense that official statements were often too neat to be true, and private recollections too damaged to rely on. She had chosen archival work because it seemed to offer a third path between propaganda and emotion. An object existed, or it did not. A tape was spliced, or it was intact. A log entry had been amended, or it had not. Facts could be stained, manipulated, withheld, but they could still be touched. That discipline had structured everything else in her life. She lived alone. She kept a modest apartment with pale walls, closed shelves, and almost no decorative screens. She read paper books. She owned one radio in the kitchen and an aging laptop she closed the instant her work was done. People in the office sometimes joked that the chief archivist lived like a cautious widow from another century. Elena accepted that with a thin smile. In truth, she had once been engaged, long ago, to a documentary editor named Martin, whose appetite for emotional immediacy had clashed fatally with her need for silence. He accused her, in the final year, of treating her own life like restricted material. She accused him of wanting confession where patience was required. They separated without spectacle and never repaired the friendship afterward. Since then, Elena had built a life in which habit served as both structure and defense. Morning coffee at precisely 7, work by 8:30, lunch rarely before 1, an evening walk if weather allowed, classical radio or none at all. No television in the apartment, especially no television. That, too, had once been explained as taste. It was not taste. At 10:30, an assistant named Jule appeared at Elena's door holding a stack of accession forms. "Sorry," she said, seeing Elena's expression. "Bad time?" "There are no good times for accession forms." Jule smiled, relieved. She was 29, bright, and always slightly underdressed for the temperature inside the building. The Leipzig regional transfer from last month has another discrepancy. 3 pneumatics were logged, but only 2 made it through intake. Also, Acquisitions wants to know whether that late-night delivery yesterday belongs under historical props or damaged scenic materials. Elena's fingers stilled over the keyboard. Late-night delivery? The crate from the basement loading bay. It wasn't in the digital manifest. Someone must have found it in overflow storage. Jule hesitated. The one with the puppet thing. Everyone's talking about it. Elena looked up. Everyone should talk less. Jule's face flushed. Of course, I just meant, leave the forms. I'll handle the classification myself. When Jule had gone, Elena stood and crossed to the office cabinet. She opened the evidence box again. In daylight, the puppet was worse. The theatricality had drained away, leaving only material fact. Singed wool, warped paint, cracked synthetic eyes, an inner mechanism exposed where the seam beneath the jaw had split open. She examined the inside with nitrile gloves and found no maker's tag, only a corroded fastening plate and traces of old adhesive. There was a smell she had not noticed the night before, faint, sweet, and electrical, like overheated insulation trapped in fabric for decades. She closed the box and locked it. The memory returned anyway. This time it came with sound. A room dark except for the television. Her mother saying from the kitchen, "Don't sit so close." A pause. Then the voice, not loud, not even fully intelligible. A murmur beneath the broadcast, as if another program were trying to breathe through it. Elena, as a child, had turned the volume down and still heard it. That was the detail that remained lodged like a splinter. The fear had not come from what she saw, but from the sensation that the television did not need sound to speak. She opened her eyes and realized she had been standing motionless for several seconds with one hand still on the cabinet key. Enough, she told herself. At noon she went to the canteen, not because she was hungry, but because normalcy required public participation. The room was crowded with staff in scarves and cardigans, balancing trays, checking phones, discussing programming budgets and transport strikes. Through the broad windows, she could see the grey sweep of the courtyard, and beyond it, a line of bare trees moving lightly in the wind. She sat alone with lentil soup and black bread. Across the room, a wall-mounted flat screen displayed a muted news channel with captions sliding beneath the minister's face. Elena kept her gaze lowered. 2 tables away, someone laughed and said, "It's the Mandela thing again. My brother swears there used to be a children's show with a rabbit in a gas mask or something." Another voice answered, "Not a rabbit, a puppet. My wife talks about it all the time. Says it gave her nightmares in the 80s. Elena looked up before she could stop herself. Neither speaker noticed her. They were younger than she was, too young to remember 1988 firsthand. The conversation had the casual texture of urban folklore, an internet curiosity dressed in old East German clothing. One of them shrugged and said, "People invent all kinds of things when nostalgia gets bored." Elena left her tray half-finished and returned upstairs. Back in her office, she did what she had not planned to do until later. She opened a second search window, this time not for infrastructure, but for content. Unverified references, orphaned metadata, scanned viewer correspondence, complaint logs, children's programming schedules from regional broadcasters, late-night test transmissions, even prank broadcasts. She entered phrases from memory and immediately deleted them, ashamed of how childish they looked in the search field. Then she chose the most neutral term she could and ran it anyway. Nothing credible appeared at first. Fragmentary forum posts, digitized magazine scans, one satirical article from the early 2000s. Then, buried deep in a cross-indexed import from local letters sent to a broadcaster complaint office in early 1989, she found a line in a poorly scanned typed memo from Leipzig District Administration. Viewer correspondence regarding unauthorized juvenile programming content received from Sector North. 14 complaints, no source confirmed, no title, no description. But it was enough to make her sit forward, because the memo had been tagged, years later, by a volunteer cataloger with a handwritten note in the margin of the scan. Children mention whispering doll. Eleanor stared at the words for a long time. She checked the date, January 17th, 1989. Whatever had happened, someone had noticed. Not on the internet decades later, not in the fever of collective memory. At the time, her office suddenly felt airless. She rose and crossed to the window, opening it an inch despite the cold. The Berlin traffic below sounded distant and unreal. Somewhere nearby, a siren moved through the city, then dissolved into ordinary noise. When she turned back toward her desk, the computer speakers emitted a brief, low burst of static. Only a fraction of a second. Barely anything. Then under the static, something like a voice. Not words. Not yet. Just the shape of a whisper. As if someone very far away had leaned toward the speaker and tested whether she was listening. Eleanor did not move for several seconds after the sound disappeared. The office remained exactly as it had been a moment earlier. The heater clicked behind the wall. A draft slipped in through the cracked window and brushed the papers on her desk. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed, then lowered their voice as a door closed. The ordinary world continued with complete indifference. Her computer speakers were silent. That silence was, in its own way, more unnerving than the burst of static had been. If the whisper had continued, if the machine had failed spectacularly, if a visible error message had flashed across the screen, then there would have been something concrete to confront. Instead, she was left with the oldest enemy of archival work and memory alike, uncertainty so small it could be dismissed. Eleanor crossed the room and shut the window. The metal latch clicked into place, with a firmness she found unexpectedly calming. Then she returned to her chair, lowered herself into it, and placed both hands flat on the desk. Think logically. The speakers were old, The archive's workstation network was stitched together from new systems laid awkwardly over legacy infrastructure. A surge, a software hiccup, a badly shielded cable, a stray signal from the internal communications loop, any of it could have produced a fragment of static. And as for the whisper, the human brain was an aggressive pattern-making device. Give it noise and unease, and it would find a voice. She repeated the explanation internally until it lost some of its force. Then she began checking the facts. First, she ran a diagnostic on the workstation's audio chain. No faults, no recent media had autoplayed. No recording software was open in the background. She checked system logs for unauthorized output triggers, remote access, driver errors. Nothing significant appeared. Then she disconnected the speakers entirely and plugged in a pair of studio headphones from the restoration desk next door. She replayed the last 5 minutes of system activity where possible, combed through caches, reopened the applications that had been active when the sound occurred. Nothing. She leaned back, disappointed by the emptiness of the result. At one level, it was reassuring. At another, it meant the event had left no footprint. That was when her gaze returned to the scanned complaint memo still open on the monitor. Viewer correspondence regarding unauthorized juvenile programming content received from Sector North. 14 complaints, no source confirmed. Children mentioned whispering doll. The note sat in the margin like a dry hand reaching across decades. Whoever had typed the original administrative summary in early 1989 had not known, or had chosen not, to describe what children were actually saying. But someone later, perhaps a volunteer digitizing old material with no expectation that anyone would care, had written the phrase plainly enough. Whispering doll. Not puppet, not fictional folklore embellished online. Not a shared fever dream from reunification nostalgia. A contemporary description, modest and bureaucratic, from the period itself. That was enough to justify a deeper search. Elena opened the archive's secondary systems, the ones staff used less often because they were messy, incomplete, and deeply unpleasant to navigate. Most digitized repositories looked clean on the surface. Years of interface design had taught institutions how to make disorder appear elegant. But beneath those polished layers, there were always older structures. Clumsy imports, inconsistent naming protocols, fragments of OCR scanned documents with spelling errors baked into the database forever, technical registries that had survived 3 governments and 2 incompatible software migrations. That was where truth often hid. She built her search carefully, refusing herself anything too imaginative. No folklore terms, no childhood phrases, only neutral descriptors that a frightened bureaucrat or engineer might have used at the time. Unauthorized content, signal anomaly, juvenile broadcast complaint, off-schedule transmission, Sector North, late-night children's programming, whispered speech, number sequence, interference. Leipzig. The first hour produced mostly noise. There were complaints about reception quality, accusations of Western jamming, household reports of distorted New Year programming, and one furious letter from a parent convinced that a weather map had briefly shown military coordinates. Elena dismissed those quickly. The East German system had generated oceans of anxious paperwork. Fear, confusion, and technical decay were all part of the texture of late-state broadcasting. Yet patterns began to emerge. At 1417, she found a maintenance note from a regional signal engineer, dated December 3, 1988. It concerned fluctuations in household television receivers across a limited district north of Leipzig. The wording was dry, almost contemptuous. No over-air irregularity detected. Interference likely domestic or sector-specific. Several residents reported image with no source identification. Complaint not escalated. Image with no source identification. Elena copied the document ID into a working file. At 1442, she uncovered a second piece, a typed service memo from the municipal utility office. Cross-indexed only because it had once been attached to a larger infrastructure request. The memo described abnormal nighttime current loads in a contained residential grid during several dates in December 1988 and early January 1989. The author speculated about illegal workshop equipment or unregistered heaters. There was a handwritten note across the bottom in blue pencil. Check relationship to television complaints. Ask B. No one had ever followed up. Elena sat very still. The phrase from the old file came back at once. The show wasn't broadcast over the air, sent through the power lines directly into plugged-in televisions. She had not yet proven anything of the sort. But the coincidence was beginning to narrow. By mid-afternoon, the office light had shifted from grey to a flat, exhausted white. Elena removed her glasses and rubbed at the side of one lens with the edge of her sleeve. She could feel the first signs of a headache, the kind that began not behind the eyes, but at the base of the skull. She ignored it. At 15:05, she left her office and descended to the basement level where the analog holdings were kept in colder, darker storage. The technician on duty, a man named Reiner with nicotine yellow fingers and a devotion to obsolete machines that bordered on tenderness, looked up from a disassembled pneumatic deck as she approached. "You're hunting ghosts," he said, seeing the slip in her hand. "VHS ghosts," Eleanor replied. "Those are the worst kind. They shed oxide everywhere." She handed him the intake number she had assigned to the degraded cassette found in the crate with the puppet. The tape itself had already been moved into quarantine after preliminary inspection. On first pass, it appeared almost unusable. Casing warped, ribbon brittle, no visible production label beyond a handwritten title that looked more scratched than written. Still, if there was anything on it, Reiner could usually coax at least a fragment into recoverable form. "I need a clean transfer," Elena said. "No enhancement yet, raw capture first, and full audio isolation." Reiner studied her face a moment longer than usual. "Today. Now, if possible." He sighed theatrically and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Come on then. If it eats the playback head, you're writing the incident report." The transfer room smelled of dust, warm circuitry, and old plastic. Racks of equipment glowed softly in the dimness. On a metal table sat the quarantined cassette in a clear evidence sleeve. Elena felt an involuntary chill when she saw the handwritten label again, broadcast from a missing station. The letters were uneven, as if written by someone forcing their hand to stay steady. Reiner loaded the tape with the care one might use when handling damaged film from a fireside. The machine gave a low mechanical whine, accepted the cassette, and hesitated. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't embarrass yourself in front of the boss." The monitor remained black. Timecode rolled, unstable but visible. No image appeared. Just black. "Dead video track," Reiner said after a few seconds, "or stripped. Could be damage. Could be deliberate." Then the speakers gave off a low hum. Elena felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten. It was not loud. In fact, it was so low at first that it seemed more felt than heard. A vibration moving somewhere between the room and the chest cavity. Reiner glanced at the level meters and frowned. "Strange carrier noise," he said. "Not broadcast standard." The hum continued, unwavering. Then, beneath it, a voice emerged. Not speech at first. Breath. A human mouth close to a microphone, or something that imitated one. The quality was degraded, flattened by age and interference, but unmistakably intentional. Reiner's hands stopped over the console. The voice began reading numbers, slowly, calmly, in German. 6, 2, 19, 40, 3, 11, 28. Eleanor took one step toward the speaker without realizing she had moved. The numbers continued in an even cadence, separated by slight pauses as though designed to be written down. There was no music, no puppet dialogue, no children's program, only the hum, the counting voice, and now and then a faint metallic click in the background that might have been relay equipment switching on and off. Reiner lowered the volume slightly. "That's not a home recording." "No," Elena said. Her own voice sounded unfamiliar to her. They let the tape run for nearly 3 minutes before the audio abruptly cut to blank hiss. Then the machine clicked and stopped as though it had reached the end. The black screen remained. Reiner ejected the cassette in silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said, "Numbers station?" Eleanor looked at him. He shrugged, uncomfortable now that he had said it aloud. "Cold War stuff. Spy broadcasts, encrypted one-way messages, usually shortwave, not VHS, but the voice, I know what a numbers station is," Elena said quietly. And she did. Most archivists working with 20th century broadcast material knew the folklore around them, disembodied voices transmitting coded strings to unseen listeners, often denied officially, impossible to fully pin down. But this was wrong in all the ways that mattered. Numbers stations belonged to radios, border static, invisible skies full of signal. They did not belong on a damaged VHS tape labeled like a children's program. "Can you isolate the hum?" she asked. Reiner nodded slowly. "Probably. Might take a while." "Why?" "Because I want to know whether it's machine noise or a carrier signature, and whether it matches anything in our infrastructure archives." "That's a very specific question." Elena's eyes remained on the ejected cassette. "I'm beginning to think this whole thing is specific." Back upstairs, she locked herself in her office and began doing something she had not done in years. She pulled a printed infrastructure atlas from the restricted shelf, one of the late GDR technical cross-references that had never been fully digitized because the diagrams were too complex and the annotations too irregular. Page after page showed relay towers, switching hubs, district power substations, and buried communication links in the rigid visual language of state planning. Then she opened a notepad and wrote down every number from the tape that she and Reiner had been able to hear clearly. 6, 2, 19, 40, 3, 11, 28. Maybe a code, maybe a sequence marker, maybe coordinates in some disguised form. She did not know yet. But she did know one thing: the numbers had not been random. The pauses were too controlled. The voice too deliberate. At 17:10, as evening pressed its blue reflection against the window, Reiner sent her the first isolated waveform of the hum. Elena enlarged it on the screen. Her breath slowed. The frequency profile looked eerily regular, stable, almost infrastructural, not the ragged contamination of a dying tape. She overlaid it with a reference library of archived electrical sound signatures from historical technical recordings. It was an odd database to possess, but archivists collected strange things when preserving old media environments. The nearest match came not from a studio, not from a broadcast carrier, and not from any known transmitter record. It matched the baseline frequency pattern of an urban electrical grid sector, a localized one, from Leipzig. Elena stared at the comparison until the office around her seemed to recede. If the match held, then the tape had preserved something impossible, or something far stranger than a television broadcast, because it suggested the signal had not traveled through the air at all. It had traveled through the city itself. And as she reached for the phone to call up the old Stasi-era infrastructure blueprints from restricted storage, she noticed something that made her hand go cold. On the pad beside her notes, without any conscious memory of writing it, she had already written the next line of numbers before the tape ever reached that point. As if some part of her had been waiting for the voice to continue. That night, Berlin seemed built from wet stone and reflected light. Elena left the archive later than she intended, carrying nothing except her handbag, her gloves, and the folded page on which she had copied the number sequence from the tape. She had made herself destroy the original scratch sheet before leaving the office, tearing it cleanly into narrow strips and dropping them into 2 separate waste bins on different floors. The gesture was irrational, almost theatrical, and she despised herself for it. But the numbers had unsettled her in a way she could not easily explain. Not because they were coded. Code was ordinary. Archives were full of encoded things, filing abbreviations, military references, abbreviated addresses, transmission identifiers, fragments of bureaucratic shorthand. What unsettled her was the feeling that the sequence had arrived twice, once from the tape and once from somewhere underneath her own memory, as if the voice reading them had passed through her before she heard it again. She crossed the courtyard with her coat collar turned up against a fine, persistent rain. The glow from the building's windows spread across the pavement in pale rectangles. Behind her, the old archive wing stood with its narrow windows lit only on a few floors, a place suspended between custody and decay. In the street beyond, buses moved through mist, and bicycles flickered past like brief mechanical shadows. By habit, Elena walked the long way to the U-Bahn. She preferred motion before entering the apartment. It gave the day a chance to loosen its grip. But that evening, the city offered no release. Every illuminated shop window became, in passing, a small screen. Every bus shelter advertisement shone too brightly. In the blackened glass of a closed electronics store, she caught her own reflection and, for a passing second, thought she saw another face behind it, round, pale, asymmetrical. She stopped so suddenly that a cyclist swore and rang his bell as he veered around her. The window held only her own reflection and rows of dormant televisions inside the dark shop. Eleanor exhaled and walked on. Her apartment, on the third floor of a renovated Altbau in Prenzlauer Berg, was warm and carefully plain. Oak floors, tall windows, white walls broken only by shelves of books and document boxes. A framed black and white photograph of the old Leipzig Hauptbahnhof hung in the hallway, not out of sentiment, but because she had once admired the composition and later discovered she could no longer remember buying it. The kitchen was narrow, the bathroom severe, the sitting room nearly empty, except for a lamp, a reading chair, and a long table where unopened mail had begun to accumulate in disciplined stacks. There was no television. There had not been one in years. She boiled water, made tea she did not drink, and placed the folded page with the numbers on the table beside the sink. Then she stood in the kitchen without removing her coat and listened to the apartment settle around her. Pipes clicking softly, the refrigerator compressor starting and stopping. Footsteps from the flat above, then silence. She should have eaten, she knew that. Hunger sharpened anxiety into something less manageable. Instead, she took the page, carried it into the sitting room, and sat under the lamp with a pencil and a legal pad. 6, 2, 1940, 3, 11, 28. She wrote the numbers again and stared at them until they began to look like strangers. Could they refer to dates? Grid sectors? Relay nodes? Coordinates in some obsolete technical notation? She retrieved one of her own notebooks from the shelf, a private working book in which she sometimes copied down irregularities too small to justify a formal file. She almost never used it for anything personal. That boundary mattered to her. Work was one category. The self was another. Tonight the boundary had already begun to fail. She spent an hour forcing logic onto the sequence. 12 possible indexing schemes, East German infrastructure abbreviations, archival shelf notations, even page-line word extraction patterns from technical manuals. Nothing held. When one possibility seemed to flicker into relevance, it dissolved under the next comparison. At 10:30, she put the pencil down and closed her eyes. Immediately, the childhood room came back. This time, the memory opened further than before. Not all at once, not with cinematic clarity, but in small, stubborn pieces. The stitched arm of a sofa, the hiss of radiators, a plate left on a side table with bread crusts still on it. Her mother standing in the doorway to the kitchen with her hands wet, listening. That detail startled Eleanor most, not watching but listening, as if the program could be understood even without the screen. Then came another fragment, and this one did not feel like memory at all until it was too late to reject. A knock at the apartment door, not in the present, back then, sharp, official, too late in the evening. Her mother stiffening, turning the television volume down but not switching it off. Her own small body on the carpet, looking up not at the screen but at her mother's face as that face became something strange, expressionless in the way adults become when trying not to show children that fear has entered the room. Elena opened her eyes. Her tea had gone cold. She had never remembered a knock before. For a long moment, she sat without moving, then reached for the phone. She dialed her mother's number in Dresden and nearly hung up after the second ring. But Marianne Weiss answered on the fourth with the breathless irritation of someone who had hurried from another room. "Elena, do you know what time it is?" "Yes, I'm sorry." Her mother's voice softened by 1 degree. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor looked at the legal pad on the table. "I need to ask you something about Leipzig, about when I was a child." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight. "That's a wide category," Marianne said at last. "Do you remember a program on television in the winter of 1988? A children's program, or something that looked like one? There was a puppet." Another silence. Then the dry sound of her mother sitting down. "Who has been talking to you?" "No one. Not really. I found something at the archive." "Eleanor." It was not a question. It was a warning in the shape of her name. She pressed on anyway. "Do you remember it?" Marianne breathed out slowly. "People remember all kinds of nonsense from that period. The country was collapsing. Systems were breaking down. Signals crossed. Everyone was tired. That isn't an answer. It is the only useful one. Eleanor felt the old familiar tension rise between them, the one that had governed so much of their adult relationship. Her mother never lied flamboyantly. She simply thinned the truth until conversation could pass through it without friction. "Did someone come to our apartment one night while it was on?" Eleanor asked. This time, the silence was so long, Elena could hear the faint electric grain in the line. When Marianne finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was smaller but harder. "You should leave these things alone." Eleanor stared ahead at the dark window over the street. So there was a night. There were many nights in the GDR that are not worth reopening. "Mother, your father told me this would happen one day." A pause. He said when enough years had passed, people would start looking backward because backward feels safer than forward. The mention of her father tightened something in Elena's chest. What did he know? Less than he pretended, more than was good for him. Marianne stopped. In the background, Elena could hear a cabinet door opening, then shutting, a glass set carefully on a counter. There was a complaint in the building, do you understand? Not from us, from someone downstairs. They said the television was making a strange sound late at night. 2 men came the next evening. They did not wear uniforms, but they asked questions like officials. They wanted to know whether anyone in the block had tampered with aerial equipment, whether we had Western receivers, whether children had been telling stories. Elena gripped the edge of the table. And had they? Marianne ignored the question. After they left, your father unplugged the set and told you not to mention the puppet again. You cried because you thought you were in trouble. That is all I remember. It was clearly not all she remembered. Who were the men? I don't know. Did father know? He suspected everyone. That was one of his talents. The attempt at dryness failed halfway through. Elena, listen to me. There are things from that time which survived only because no one insisted on understanding them. Sometimes that is mercy. The line crackled softly. Elena closed her eyes. Did you ever see it yourself, the program? When Marianne answered, the words were so quiet, Elena nearly missed them. I heard it from the kitchen. The room seemed to tilt. The memory was real then, not complete and not trustworthy in every detail, but anchored to another witness. Her mother had heard it too. Before Elena could ask another question, Marianne said with sudden sharpness, "If this is about your work, be careful who you ask. There was a man, years later, who came to the school where I taught after reunification. He was looking for old staff who had lived in our district in Leipzig. He asked whether children had reported unusual broadcasts. I told him no. He came only once. Who was he? He said he was writing a media history." A brittle pause. He was lying. Then, before Elena could stop her, Marianne ended the call. The apartment became very still. Elena remained seated with the silent phone in her hand and the legal pad in front of her. Her mother had confirmed more in 5 minutes than Eleanor had been able to verify in a day. There had been complaints, there had been visitors, and there had been another person searching after reunification. Someone else had noticed the same pattern and followed it far enough to frighten people. But he had stopped. Or been stopped. Just before midnight, Elena took her notebook from the shelf and opened a fresh page. She wrote 3 names at the top in block capitals. Her father, mother's visitor, old man from the lobby. Then beneath them she wrote a 4th line. Who quit searching? She should have gone to bed after that. Instead, she returned to the kitchen for water and found herself standing over the sink, listening. At first, she thought the sound came from a neighboring apartment. A low, intermittent hum, too steady to be music and too tonal to be plumbing. She turned off the refrigerator light, held her breath, and waited. The hum remained, not loud, not outside, inside the walls. She followed it down the hallway to the utility cupboard, where the apartment's electrical panel sat recessed behind a painted door. The hum strengthened as she drew near. Not enough to be heard by anyone who was not listening for it, but enough. Her hand hesitated on the cupboard latch. Then she opened it. Inside, behind the rows of labeled breakers, someone had taped a small rectangle of yellowed paper to the back panel. The tape had long dried and curled. The paper looked decades old. On it, written in blue pencil in a hand she recognized instantly as her father's, were 7 numbers. 6, 2, 19, 40, 3, 11, 28, and beneath them one sentence. Not broadcast, conducted. By dawn, the paper from the electrical cupboard lay inside a transparent document sleeve on Elena's kitchen table, weighed down at two corners by books she had not opened in years. She had not slept. The city outside had turned gradually from black to a bruised grey, and still she remained awake, moving between the kitchen and the sitting room with the careful, deliberate motions of someone afraid that a sudden gesture might make the facts rearrange themselves. Every hour or so she returned to the sleeve and looked again at her father's handwriting, as if repetition might force some new layer of meaning to rise from the graphite. 6, 2, 19, 40, 3, 11, 28. Not broadcast, conducted. The words were simple enough to understand and impossible to digest. Her father had written them, not in a notebook, not on the back of a utility invoice, not in the margins of some technical manual where an isolated thought might live harmlessly among other notes. He had taped them inside the apartment's electrical panel, in a place that suggested two opposite intentions at once. Concealment and preservation, something he did not want found casually, something he did not want lost entirely. Eleanor had handled the paper with gloves. She had photographed it under the kitchen lamp. She had compared the handwriting to the notes her father used to leave beside the telephone or on the hall table when she was a teenager. The angle of the numerals matched. The pressure pattern in the pencil strokes matched. Even the way he formed the number 2, beginning too high and pulling the tail farther right than necessary, was unmistakable. She did not need forensic confirmation. She needed context. By 7:15, she had showered, dressed, and packed the document sleeve between two hardback books in her satchel. She stood at the front door longer than necessary, looking back down the narrow hall toward the open utility cupboard. The breakers sat behind their labels with insulting normality. Kitchen, bath, corridor, lights, sockets. Nothing about the panel suggested that for decades it had hidden a note linking childhood memory, electrical infrastructure, and whatever had moved through televisions in Leipzig during the winter of 1988. Elena closed the cupboard, locked the apartment, and went to work. The archive was quieter than usual when she arrived. A transport strike had reduced staff numbers, and the weather, raw, wet, threatening sleet, kept visitors thinly scattered through the reading rooms. On the upper floor, a smell of old paper and floor polish hung in the corridor. Eleanor went straight to her office, locked the door, and placed the sleeve on the desk beside the scanned complaint memo and Reiner's frequency isolation printout. Seen together, the materials formed something far more dangerous than proof. They formed direction, a degraded VHS tape carrying no video, only a low-frequency hum and a counting voice. A historical complaint memo describing a whispering doll. A sector-specific electrical anomaly noted at the time. Her mother's confirmation that unofficial visitors had questioned residents in their building. Her father's concealed note stating flatly that the signal was conducted rather than broadcast. She stared at the line for a long moment. Conducted. In technical language, the word could mean many things. Guided through a medium. Carried along an existing pathway. Transmitted not through the air, but through physical infrastructure. It was not poetic. It was precise. Her father had been an engineer. He had chosen the term deliberately. At 8:10, she called up the restricted catalogue for state-era infrastructure holdings that had never been fully integrated into the public system. Access required departmental clearance and, ordinarily, a stated preservation purpose. Eleanor was the chief archivist. When necessary, she was also the purpose. She searched for district power grid overlays cross-indexed with broadcast or signal relay plans in Leipzig, specifically those involving municipal utility coordination between 1985 and 1989. The results were sparse. Entire record groups had been transferred after reunification in damaged or partial form. Others had been abstracted into inventory descriptions so vague they bordered on parody. Supplementary engineering materials, field adaptation diagrams, unclassified utility cooperation binder, audio pathway testing notes. The last entry made her sit forward. It was attached to a partially digitized holdings group from a former regional technical office that had been absorbed, renamed, relocated, and eventually dismantled in the administrative chaos of the 1990s. The physical materials, according to the record, had been moved years earlier into off-site basement storage beneath the old archive annex and never fully processed because of mold contamination in several boxes. Elena rose at once, took the service lift down 2 levels, and crossed the subterranean corridor connecting the main building to the annex. The passage had once been painted institutional green, but only flakes remained in some sections. Pipes ran low overhead. Motion sensors triggered pools of light that blinked on reluctantly as she walked. Her heels sounded unnaturally loud against the concrete. At the annex desk sat a single attendant, an elderly contractor named Herr Brenner, who had worked in storage environments so long he seemed to belong to them physically. He wore fingerless gloves, drank tea from a jar, and looked up over rimless spectacles when Elena approached. "You're early for mold season," he said. "I need access to the unprocessed Leipzig technical transfer from the south basement. Holdings group K44, if the shelf map is current." Brenner frowned. Those boxes were flagged years ago. Half of them were water damaged. So were most honest records. He gave a dry snort, checked a paper ledger instead of the terminal, and disappeared through the wire door at the rear. When he returned, he carried a key ring and the expression of a man indulging professional obsession only because he recognized its authority. 20 minutes, he said. No more. The airflow down there is bad. The south basement smelled of cardboard rot, coal dust, and concrete that had never fully dried. Shelving rose in dim rows under caged bulbs. Boxes sat with their old transfer labels half peeled, some wrapped in brittle plastic, others bowed inward from long exposure to damp. Brenner led her to an end bay, where a stack of grey archive cartons rested beneath a warning tag dated almost 9 years earlier. K44. Unprocessed technical materials, Leipzig region. Check for contamination before handling. Eleanor pulled on gloves, opened the top carton, and began sorting. At first, it was exactly what institutional neglect always looked like. Mixed folders, duplicate engineering forms, cable procurement lists, maintenance schedules, annotated diagrams without legends, invoices for replacement valves, coffee stains fossilized into paper. But she knew how to read such mess. Disorder in archives was rarely random. It reflected the moment of abandonment. By the 4th folder, she found what she had come for. A thin blue binder with the stamped title removed by water, leaving only an embossed impression visible when tilted toward the light. Inside were sheaves of onion skin duplicates and folded diagrams so large she had to clear a section of shelf top to open them safely. One heading remained legible in full: Supplementary Conduction Trials, Sector North, Leipzig. Her throat tightened. The document bore no ministry seal on the front page, only an internal routing code and the typed names of departments that had no business appearing together in one file: regional broadcasting support, municipal electrical maintenance, behavioral acoustics, and something abbreviated simply as ZK12. The pages beneath were worse. Technical tables, voltage tolerances, household receiver compatibility lists, notes on line stability, references to acoustic response under low-frequency modulation. There were no narrative explanations, no explicit statement of purpose, but the shape of the thing was unmistakable. Someone had designed a method of sending structured audio content through a local electrical network and into domestic television receivers connected to mains power. Not theoretically, operationally. Eleanor turned another page with hands that were no longer steady. A diagram showed a sector map of Leipzig with certain residential blocks shaded in red pencil. Her childhood address sat just inside the marked zone. For a moment she could only look. The shelves around her, the damp smell, Brenner's quiet presence several meters away, all of it seemed to fall back behind the flat white of the paper. It was one thing to suspect involvement, another to see one's own building absorbed into technical notation. She forced herself onward. Near the middle of the binder lay a smaller insert folded into thirds, different stock, different typewriter alignment. Not a formal engineering document, more like an attachment inserted later by someone who expected the primary readers to understand without explanation. Across the top, in red pencil, was written simply, "For test environment consistency." Beneath it was a list. Item: puppet form, child-facing, voice treatment, sub-audible bed under spoken sequence. Visual carrier optional. Preferred hours, post-evening family viewing. Response environment, domestic interior, reduced supervision, fatigue onset. Elena's vision blurred for a second and she blinked hard. Not because she did not understand the words, because she understood them too well. Domestic interior, reduced supervision, fatigue onset. Children in living rooms while adults washed dishes, folded laundry, smoked by kitchen windows, drifted into the numb tiredness of late evening. Not a broadcast event. An environment, a condition, a designed moment of vulnerability. Dr. Weiss? Brenner's voice came from behind her, muted with concern. She did not turn immediately. I'm fine. You don't look fine. That at least was true. Elena closed the folder, then opened it again because the act of closing it felt too much like surrender. A smaller envelope had slid loose from the back pocket of the binder. It was discolored, unsealed, and held something rigid inside. She eased it open. A cassette tape, much smaller than VHS, slid into her gloved palm. An audio microcassette, the kind used for dictated notes or field memos. On its label, in faded blue ink, someone had written a date. 9th of November, 1989. And beneath it, 2 words. Bunker retrieval. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs in a measured, soundless rush. The old man in the lobby had said he stole the puppet from the bunker on the night the wall fell. Until now, that had been a dying man's impossible claim attached to an object too disturbing to classify. But this tape, if authentic, suggested someone had documented a retrieval on that exact date. She looked back into the envelope. One more item remained inside. A contact sheet-sized photograph, silvering at the edges, likely printed in haste. The image showed a concrete corridor lit by a single bare bulb. At the far end stood a metal door with stenciled numbers on it. Leaning against the wall beside the door was the puppet. Intact then. Not melted yet. Its head was turned toward the camera as if listening. Eleanor lifted the photograph closer to the light. The door number came into focus slowly through the grain. 6/2/1940-3/11/28. Not a code, a location. And before she could speak, before even the shock had fully taken shape, Brenner made a small sound in his throat and stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. That's odd, he murmured. What? He pointed not at the door, but at the bottom margin of the photograph. Stamped there in purple ink, nearly invisible against the dark concrete, was a processing mark from the old regional archive system. Returned to Requestor 1997. Someone had already found this file after reunification. Someone had handled it, marked it, and then sent it back out into the world. And whoever that requester had been, they had never finished the story. By the time Eleanor returned to her office, the weather had turned. What had begun in the morning as cold rain now struck the windows in hard, granular bursts that sounded almost like thrown sand. The sky over Berlin had flattened into a dull metallic white, and the archive building, with its narrow corridors and sealed doors, felt less like a workplace than a vessel under pressure. She locked the office before setting down her satchel. The binder from the south basement, the microcassette and the photograph were still wrapped in the temporary transfer cloth Brenner had given her, an old conservator's habit for carrying unstable materials without announcing their importance. Elena placed them on the desk one by one, then stood over them without touching anything. Supplementary conduction trials, a marked residential sector that included her childhood address. A procedural sheet describing a puppet form designed for a domestic environment with children present. A photograph bearing the same sequence of numbers her father had hidden in the electrical cupboard. A return stamp from 1997. Someone else had looked into this after reunification. Someone had requested the file, handled the photograph, and either failed to expose what it meant or decided the exposure would cost too much. That realization disturbed Elena more than the technical documents themselves, because secrets from the GDR had survived for many reasons. Files were lost, evidence burned, careers were protected. Institutions reinvented themselves and carried old loyalties into new administrative language. But this felt different, not a dead secret forgotten by time. A live one, revisited and then set back into the shelf. At 11:40, her phone rang. The internal display showed the office of the archive director. Elena let it ring once more before answering. Weiss? "Could you come upstairs?" asked the director's assistant. "Dr. Hallberg would like a word." Not a request, then. Elena looked at the objects on her desk and felt something cold settle into place beneath her ribs. She slid the photograph and the microcassette into separate acid-free envelopes, locked them in her drawer, and carried only the binder with her. Halfway to the door, she stopped, went back and removed the binder as well. No. She took nothing. Dr. Matthias Hallberg occupied the corner office on the administrative floor, where the windows were broader and the furniture managed to suggest both public transparency and private expense. He was a careful man in his early 60s, with polished diction and a face that never fully disclosed whether it approved of anything. His professional talent lay in making cultural budgets sound moral and procedural caution sound like civic virtue. Elena had worked under him for 6 years and trusted him in exactly the way one trusts a firewall. Useful, impersonal, never intimate. He stood when she entered, but only halfway. "Elena, thank you. Close the door, would you?" That, more than the summons itself, sharpened her attention. She closed it and remained standing. Hallberg glanced toward a folder on his desk. "Security logged an unusual visitor for you last night. An elderly man, no appointment. Medical emergency followed." "Yes." "And staff this morning reported that an uncatalogued object from a late delivery is being held in your office, rather than processed through acquisitions." Elena said nothing. Hallberg folded his hands. "Ordinarily, I would assume professional discretion. Unfortunately, the combination of those details has already produced rumors. You know how quickly this building manufactures folklore." It was an elegant opening, a way of framing her choices as administrative rather than substantive. "Is there a point to this?" Elena asked. "There is. A representative from legal called me about an hour ago. Apparently, someone has inquired whether we maintain holdings related to unauthorized experimental transmissions in the late GDR period." A pause. They did not identify themselves clearly. Elena felt the room narrow by a degree. "And legal thought of me." "Legal thought of the archive. I thought of you." Hallberg's tone remained mild. "You have a reputation for pursuing difficult material with unusual persistence. Usually that is an asset. In this case, I would advise restraint. On what grounds? On the grounds that state-era technical archives are full of fragments that invite fantasy. And because we are a broadcasting institution, not a tribunal for unresolved Cold War mythology." There it was. Mythology. The word had already begun circulating. Elena kept her face still. "If someone is asking whether we hold specific records, the answer depends on whether we do." Hallberg's eyes rested on her a moment longer than before. "Do we?" She could have lied. The lie arrived fully formed and almost persuasive. "Not that I've seen," but something in his expression told her he was not really asking for information. He was testing proximity. "We hold many incomplete regional technical materials," she said. "As you know, no." "As I know," he repeated. Then, with a faint sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "Let me be direct. There are topics that attract damaged people. False memory movements, conspiracy hobbyists, former officials reinventing themselves as witnesses. If you find yourself near one of these narratives, I would prefer you not become its curator." Elena met his gaze. "And if the narrative is attached to physical evidence?" Hallberg smiled, but only with his mouth. "Then physical evidence should be examined professionally, not emotionally." It was a clean sentence, reasonable even. Yet the last word landed with deliberate force. Emotionally. He knew then, or suspected, about Leipzig, about her background, perhaps only from personnel files, perhaps from the old man's visit, perhaps from something else. It did not matter. The implication was the same. She was too close. "Is this a warning?" she asked. "It is concern. They often resemble each other here." For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Take care, Elena. Institutions protect themselves when they feel narrative instability growing around them. I would rather not see you caught in that machinery." The conversation ended there, in the way bureaucratic conversations often do. Not with clarity, but with a shared understanding that the real message had already been delivered. When she returned to her office, her inbox held 3 new messages. The first was from IT security, informing all staff of routine maintenance on archival servers scheduled for that evening. The second was from legal, copying Hallberg, reminding department heads that unverified material relating to state surveillance, intelligence practices, or psychological operations should not be discussed externally without review. The third had no subject line. It came from an address that appeared to be internal but unresolved when she clicked its metadata. No sender name, no signature. The body contained only one sentence. Some records were never meant to be remembered in public. Elena stared at it until the screen blurred. Then she forwarded the message to ET for trace analysis and received an automatic confirmation that the ticket had been opened. By mid-afternoon, the pressure had moved from abstract to practical. 2 access requests she submitted for supplementary infrastructure files were suddenly marked pending review. Brenner from the annex phoned to say that someone from Preservation Oversight had asked whether basement materials from K44 had been removed from controlled storage without full contamination recertification. Reiner sent a terse note saying the clean transfer suite was temporarily unavailable due to unscheduled systems diagnostics. Even Jewel, who rarely noticed institutional weather until it was raining directly on her, paused at Elena's door and asked in an embarrassed half-whisper, "Did you do something? Everyone's acting strange." "Everyone is always acting strange," Elena said, but her tone lacked conviction. At 4:30, she gave up on pretending the day still belonged to normal work. She locked the office, took the service stairs down to the basement audiovisual lab, and found Reiner sitting in the dim transfer room with a mug of coffee growing cold near his elbow. "You're not under diagnostics," she said. He did not bother denying it. "They told me not to prioritize your tape." "Who is they?" "Choose a noun. Management, compliance, security. One of those departments that only appears when everyone starts using the word protocol." He rubbed at his jaw. "What did you find?" Eleanor hesitated. She trusted Reiner more than most people in the building, but trust was becoming an expensive habit. Still, she needed one ally, however provisional. "Something that makes the hum on the tape more significant," she said, "and I need that microcassette played today. Off system, no network path, no central logging." Reiner let out a low breath. "That bad?" "Potentially." He considered her for several seconds. The dim blue light from the dormant monitors made the creases in his face look deeper. "I can do off-grid in the old dubbing room," he said at last. "Standalone deck. No building connection. But if someone asks, I was calibrating azimuth." "Fine." "And Eleanor," she looked at him, "if this turns into one of those things where I'm found wandering a corridor saying I should have minded my own business, I want it on record that I did, in fact, mind it. You dragged me in." Against all logic, she almost smiled. Julie noted. They waited until after 6, when offices emptied and the building's human noise began to recede into isolated pockets. Then Reiner took her through a disused editing suite at the rear of the basement, past obsolete cabinets and coiled cables into an older dubbing room that had survived modernization mostly because no one remembered it existed. Dust lay along the lower edges of the wall panels. A single lamp threw a yellow pool across the workbench. The microcassette deck on the table looked older than either of them. Reiner inserted the tape. For a moment, only hiss. Then footsteps. Muffled, hurried, reverberating in concrete space. A man breathing too close to the recorder. Another voice in the distance saying something Elena could not catch. Metal clanging. A door opening, then the first speaker, low and unsteady. 9th of November. Past midnight, I think. We got inside through the service tunnel under the tower base. If anyone hears this later, the equipment is still warm. It was never shut down. Eleanor felt the skin along her arms tighten. The voice continued, interrupted by echoes and movement. No stage, no cameras, nothing like a children's studio. Rows of tanks along the rear chamber. Headphones, wiring, some kind of soundproof compartments or sensory booths. There are manuals here, sealed cabinets, frequency charts. We found the puppet in a side room near the generator housing. Carl says leave it. I'm taking one as proof. A second voice, sharper and farther away, broke in. Don't touch the panels. The recorder jolted. Then the first man again, now whispering. There's another room below, marked with sequence code 62219-423-1128. Access door locked. We can hear... The tape distorted in a burst of scraping noise. Then came a sound so strange, Elena first thought the deck had malfunctioned. A child's voice, or something deliberately built to resemble one, speaking softly through static. Not from the room with the recorder, from somewhere on the original tape. Do not remember me with the lights on. The sentence was followed by a violent crack and a shouted curse. Then running footsteps, the recorder striking a wall, and the abrupt end of the cassette. Neither Elena nor Rainer spoke for several seconds after it stopped. Finally he said, very quietly, "That isn't a hoax." "No," Elena answered. Her mouth had gone dry again. He ejected the cassette and set it on the table as though it might still be hot. "What are you going to do?" The answer should have been obvious. Inform legal, secure the material, request external review. Follow procedure. Instead, Elena heard herself say, "Find the requester from 1997. Rainer blinked. "That's the priority." "Yes, because someone found the bunker after reunification, requested the file, and then disappeared. I need to know whether they stopped by choice or because someone made the choice for them." She took the cassette and slipped it back into its envelope. When they emerged from the old dubbing room, the basement corridor was dark, except for the emergency strip lights near the floor. Elena had the distinct, irrational impression that the building was listening. She disliked the thought immediately, but could not shake it. Upstairs, her office computer would not accept her password. She tried again. Then a third time, slower. Access denied. A system alert appeared, followed by another, then a black screen. For an instant, a field of static rippled across the monitor. Fine, white, CRT-like noise, impossible on a modern flat panel. And there, for less than a second, a face formed inside it. Round, cracked. One eye collapsed inward, the puppet. Then the image vanished, replaced by a red notice from Central IT. Archival user profile temporarily suspended pending security review. Before Elena could react, lights went on up and down the corridor in abrupt sequence. Doors opened, voices rose. Somewhere nearby, someone shouted for the systems team. She turned toward the noise just as Jewel came running from the stairwell, pale and breathless. "Elena, your office. What happened?" Jewel looked as if she had to force the words through disbelief. "All your archive folders are gone. Not moved. Gone. The whole audio-visual index you were working in, it's wiped." And on 3 of the terminals in Reading Room B, the speakers started playing a humming sound. The corridor seemed to drop away beneath Elena's feet. Jewel swallowed hard. People are saying it sounded like someone whispering numbers. By 7 that evening, the building had acquired the brittle atmosphere of a place pretending not to be afraid. Technicians moved quickly but avoided eye contact. The reading rooms had been cleared under the pretext of a systems incident. Security staff stood in clusters near the main stairwell with the stiff posture of men who had been told too little and therefore assumed the worst. The usual institutional sounds, printers, voices, carts, the restless machinery of archiving, had thinned into something smaller and more careful. From her office doorway, Eleanor watched 2 members of the IT response team work at the terminal where her account had been suspended. They spoke in clipped, low tones, one taking photographs of the screen state, the other unplugging peripherals and labeling cables with yellow tabs. On the desk, her work had been transformed into an absence. Directory paths she knew by muscle memory no longer resolved. Index files returned blank errors. Even the working folder she had created that morning, a simple temporary set of copied document IDs, had been stripped from the machine so cleanly that it was as though she had imagined its existence. A sophisticated malware attack, she thought. But the phrase felt too modern, too sleek to describe what had happened here. Malware belonged to cyber headlines, breached accounts, stolen credentials. This had the texture of something older, entering a newer medium. An old instinct translated into digital form. Erase the trail, isolate the witness, make the system itself seem unreliable. Hallberg appeared at 7:30 in the corridor outside her office, coat still on, his face arranged into the disciplined concern of a man managing both crisis and reputation. "You should go home," he said. Eleanor did not look away from the technicians. "That usually means I shouldn't. It means the building is now under formal review." "By whom?" Internal security, external IT consultants, and possibly federal records compliance if the scope widens. He paused. This is no longer an environment for private initiatives. She turned to face him. My files were erased. I'm aware. And you still think this is about narrative instability? His expression tightened by a degree. I think you are too intelligent to force me into saying imprudent things in a corridor full of staff. Then say a prudent thing. Hallberg glanced toward the office, where one of the technicians was now removing the drive image unit. Prudent thing, he said quietly. Whatever line you have crossed, step back over it tonight. The choice of words hung between them. Not if, whatever. He knew more than he would admit. Before she could answer, one of the IT technicians approached holding a tablet. Dr. Weiss, we need confirmation on whether anyone besides you had access to a local copy set labeled K44 notes and signal comparison overlays. Elena felt Hallberg's eyes settle briefly on her face. No, she said. Then after a beat, one technician assisted with audio isolation. Name? Rainer Schultz. Hallberg said nothing, but she caught the faint movement of disapproval in his jaw. Naming Rainer would put him into the official account. Not naming him would make the omission itself suspicious later. There were moments when every available choice became a form of damage. This was one of them. By 8, Eleanor had been instructed to surrender her office key temporarily, sign an incident statement, and await clearance before accessing restricted materials again. She complied only to the letter. Her private notebook was already in her bag. The photograph from the binder, the micro-cassette, and a hand-copied extract from the conduction trial documents had been removed from the office drawer long before the technicians reached her floor. Only the duplicate notes remained behind. As she left the building, sleet rattled against the glass entrance doors. The city outside had become a blur of wet headlights and tram wires glowing in the dark. She pulled up her collar and began walking without deciding where. Going home felt premature, almost naive. The apartment now contained her father's hidden note and the knowledge that someone had once used electrical infrastructure as a pathway into domestic life. It did not feel entirely hers anymore. At Schönhauser Allee, she stopped under the awning of a closed pharmacy and took out her phone. She had one practical lead left that did not depend on archive systems. 1997. Return to Requestor. Someone had requested the K44 file after reunification. If the record of that request still existed anywhere outside the sabotaged digital index, it would most likely survive in paper circulation logs or offloaded accession ledgers. Those were not on her office machine. They lived in old departmental binders, in basement admin cabinets, and sometimes in the private boxes of retired staff who distrusted database migrations. Eleanor knew one such retired staff member. His name was Dieter Maas, and before retirement he had overseen regional transfer intake during the ragged years when East German holdings were poured into new federal systems with more speed than care. He had once described the 1990s archive process as a funeral conducted by accountants. Elena had not seen him in nearly 3 years. He lived in Köpenick now, surrounded, as rumor had it, by paper no modern institution could make him surrender. She called the number she still had for him. He answered on the 5th ring with a suspicious, gravelly, "Ja?" "Herr Maas, it's Elena Weiss." Silence, then a cough. "You only call when the dead are moving again." "Possibly." Another silence, this one more attentive. "Then come now. Before I decide I'm too old for this sentence." His apartment overlooked a canal gone black in the weather. Books and file boxes occupied every wall. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage, dust, and old tobacco preserved in curtains that had not been washed in years. Maas himself was in his late 70s, narrow-shouldered, white-haired, and alert in the manner of men who had spent their working lives noticing what others mislabeled as routine. He wore a cardigan patched at one elbow and eyed Elena over the rims of thick spectacles, as though assessing not only her condition, but the proportions of the trouble behind her. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you. Sit down. Don't touch the stack by the radiator. That one bites." She sat at a table already half covered in open folders. Maas brought tea in heavy mugs and lowered himself opposite her with visible effort. "Now," he said, "who has started erasing what?" Elena did not waste time with a preamble. She told him about the uncatalogued puppet prop, the old man in the lobby, the degraded VHS tape carrying only hum and numbers, the K-44 basement binder, the conduction trial sheets, and the photograph stamped return to requester in 1997. She did not mention Hallberg by name until the end, but by then she could see from Mars's expression that he had already mapped the outlines. When she finished, he remained quiet for so long that the apartment's minor sounds became overly distinct. The radiator ticking, water moving in the pipes, sleet against the windows. At last he said, "I told them those Leipzig materials were wrong when they came through." Elena leaned forward. "Who is they?" "Everyone, no one. The usual administrative cloud of people who prefer labels to realities. Some folders arrived with technical routing stamps that didn't match their ministry classifications. Utility records bundled with broadcasting support. Acoustic testing attached to district maintenance. It was nonsense on the surface and therefore interesting underneath." He lifted one shoulder. "In those years we were drowning. Again, thousands of boxes, former district offices closing overnight. People wanted speed, not interpretation. Do you remember the requester in 1997? Mars reached behind him to a narrow cabinet and pulled out a ledger book, thick enough to stun an ox. He opened it with reverence rather than strain. The pages were ruled by hand in blue lines and filled with his dense, disciplined script. "I kept my own copy ledger when the central system was unreliable," he said, "officially unnecessary, therefore essential." He turned pages, wetting one fingertip lightly against his thumb. Eleanor watched the dates move backward through 1999, 1998, then settle on a section marked 1997 with a strip of yellow paper. K-44. K-44, yes. His finger stopped. There. Special file withdrawal, regional technical transfer, Leipzig. Authorized review under reunification media anomalies subproject. He squinted. Requester, Dr. Hanno Berlich. The name meant nothing to Eleanor. Who was he? Mars gave a dry smile. That depends which version you want. Officially, a media historian affiliated for a time with a Cultural Memory Institute in Halle. Unofficially, a man with the social grace of an open wound and the stubbornness of mold. He believed there were undisclosed psychological testing interfaces buried in late-state broadcasting infrastructure. Most people dismissed him. He kept being right in small ways that embarrassed comfortable narratives. Eleanor felt a small pulse of vindication, immediately followed by dread. Is he alive? Mars's expression altered. Not exactly the question I'd start with, he said, but mine. He closed the ledger halfway and rested both hands on it. He vanished from the archive circuit in 1998. Some said he had a breakdown. Some said he became convinced old broadcast networks were still active and began sounding unstable. There was a rumor about hospitalization, another about a fire in a storage unit he rented outside Leipzig. Nothing clean enough to trust. The apartment seemed to contract. Did he leave papers? Notes? Mars hesitated. Then he rose, walked slowly to a box on the far shelf, and returned with a slim folder tied in cloth tape. These came to me by accident, he said, or by design. Hard to tell with him. He mailed them 2 weeks before he disappeared from professional view. No letter, no explanation, just a package with my office address. I opened it, realized immediately that keeping it violated at least 3 procedures, and therefore kept it. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were photocopies, handwritten notes, and one contact print Elena recognized with a jolt. The same bunker corridor, the same metal door, marked 6/2/1940-3/11/28. Berlich had annotated the margin in black ink. No evidence of studio use. Environmental conditioning chambers present. Child response architecture possible, though purpose unclear. Beneath the contact print lay a second photograph Elena had not seen before. It showed a wall of numbered lockers inside a concrete room. One locker door stood ajar. Inside it sat dozens of puppet heads wrapped in clear plastic, their faces unfinished, some with eyes missing, some with skin tone paint only half applied. On the back of the photo, Berlich had written one sentence. Not a program. A delivery system. Eleanor felt a wave of cold move through her so abruptly that she had to set the photograph down. Mars watched her without comment. There were more notes beneath. Berlich's handwriting slanted aggressively uphill, as though he distrusted the page's willingness to hold the truth. He had sketched tentative relationships between municipal grid sectors, decommissioned relay towers, and what he labeled acoustic inoculation pathways. Much of it remained speculative, but certain phrases repeated with increasing certainty. Memory reinforcement through domestic repetition. Signal piggybacking via mains fluctuations. Full source identification essential. Tower may be decoy memory anchor. Elena stopped at that last line. Tower may be decoy memory anchor. She looked up slowly. What does that mean? Mars shrugged. With Berlich, it could mean brilliance or sleep deprivation. Sometimes both. But Eleanor understood enough. People remembered the puppet show as coming from the tower because the tower was the most visible symbol available. A landmark, a source the mind could assign to an experience that had actually traveled through something more intimate and invisible. The tower was not only false, it may have been useful to remember falsely. That was why the contradiction had persisted for decades, because disproving the tower did not disprove the event. It merely removed the wrong doorway. Mars took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief. There's something else, he said. Berlich wrote one name more than any other in these notes. Not as a suspect, more like a shadow he kept seeing behind the paper trail. He turned over the final sheet in the folder. At the top was written, Leon Falk. Underneath, son of lead scientist, neurolinguistic acoustics section. Disappeared from official records after 1990. Possible technical inheritance. Unknown current activity. Eleanor read the lines twice. A son. The mystery shifted slightly. And with that shift came something more dangerous than fear. Intimacy. The sudden sense that the past had not remained in files and dead equipment. It had descended, privately, through blood. Why didn't Berlich publish any of this, she asked. Mars gave a short, humorless laugh. Perhaps he tried. He looked toward the window, where the sleet had thickened into a white hiss. Or perhaps he decided that proving a generation had been touched by something designed to enter through the home would damage more people than it helped. Men like that often mistake moral exhaustion for caution. Elena gathered the pages carefully. Among them was a torn scrap from what looked like an address book. One location had been underlined twice. Leipzig, Möckern district, former utilities training compound. And next to it, in Berlich's hand, ask caretaker about sub-level access after flood sealing. She looked at Mars. Did he ever go there? I don't know. Do you think the address matters? Mars put his spectacles back on and met her gaze. At this point, Dr. Weiss, I think you have passed beyond the phase where anything is merely interesting. When she finally rose to leave, he caught her wrist lightly. Not enough to restrain, just enough to insist on a final sentence. If you continue, he said, understand one thing clearly. People who build systems to enter memory do not need to convince everyone. They only need to make witnesses doubt the shape of what they know. That's how the mechanism survives. Outside, the sleet had thinned to freezing rain. Eleanor stood for a moment under the building's entrance light, the folder inside her satchel. Berlich's photographs pressing like extra weight against her side. Across the canal, a line of apartment windows glowed in muted yellow rectangles. Domestic interiors, reduced supervision, fatigue onset. The phrase from the conduction sheet returned with new force. Not a program, a delivery system. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number. She answered without greeting. A woman's voice, older, strained, and very controlled, said, "You don't know me. My name is Ruth Berlich. I'm Hanno Berlich's sister. Someone told me you were asking about him." Elena stopped breathing for an instant. "Yes," she said. There was a pause filled with the sound of traffic and weak line noise. Then the woman said, "He left something for the person who came after him, but you must not bring any recording devices into my house. And if anyone follows you, don't come at all." The line went dead before Elena could answer. Ruth Berlich lived in a narrow post-war apartment block on a quiet street in Lichtenberg, where the trees had already surrendered most of their leaves and the pavements held the damp chill of old concrete. Elena arrived just after 9, having changed trains twice and walked the last 3 blocks in deliberate zigzags, pausing once at a bakery window and once under the awning of a closed locksmith to check the reflections behind her. The ritual felt excessive until she remembered the erased files, the anonymous message, the phantom image on her office screen, and the old warning in Ruth's voice. If anyone follows you, don't come at all. No one appeared to be following her. That did not mean no one was. The entrance hall smelled faintly of cabbage, floor cleaner, and radiator heat. A row of dented metal mailboxes lined the wall beneath a buzzing intercom panel whose labels had been rewritten too many times. Ruth had told her on the phone to use neither the bell nor the intercom. Just come up, 3rd floor, door at the end. Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, listening. On the 2nd landing, she heard a television through a wall somewhere. Not loud enough to distinguish words, only that dull, intimate murmur of domestic broadcast life. It made the back of her neck tighten. By the time she reached the 3rd floor, she was aware of her own breathing. The door at the end of the corridor opened before she knocked. Ruth Bellick was smaller than Elena expected and older too, though not by many years. Perhaps 60, perhaps slightly more. Her hair, once dark, had gone silver in uneven streaks and was pinned back carelessly. She wore a plain grey cardigan over a black dress and regarded Eleanor with the exhausted alertness of someone who had already spent too much of life deciding whom not to trust. "Inside, Isha," she said, quickly. The apartment had been arranged as if with deliberate hostility toward unnecessary technology. No smart speaker, no visible computer. A radio on the kitchen counter looked at least 20 years old. In the sitting room, there was no television, only bookshelves, a green-shaded lamp, and a wooden cabinet whose drawers bore neatly typed labels. The air smelled of tea, dust, and something medicinal. Ruth closed the door, engaged the lock, then turned and held out her hand. Phone. Eleanor gave it to her. Ruth took it to the kitchen, placed it inside a metal biscuit tin already lined with folded dish towels, closed the lid, and set another smaller tin on top of it. "Probably ridiculous," she said on returning. But Hanno stopped thinking it was ridiculous long before I did. She motioned Elena toward the table. "Sit, and tell me first what exactly you found, so I can hear whether you came by your own steps or by someone else's plan." Elena told her almost everything, not every emotional detail, not the apartment panel, not the precise shape of the whisper in her office speakers, not the private humiliation of recognizing the puppet before she ever admitted it to herself. But she spoke plainly about the old man in the lobby, the degraded VHS, the conducted audio, the basement binder, the marked residential sector, the return stamp from 1997, and her visit to Dieter Maas. She mentioned Hanno's photographs. She mentioned Leon Falk. At that name, Ruth's face altered, not with surprise, with recognition so weary it might once have been fear. When Elena finished, Ruth did not answer immediately. She rose, went to the cabinet in the sitting room, unlocked the top drawer with a small brass key from her pocket, and removed a thin cardboard portfolio tied with black ribbon. She set it on the table between them. "My brother left this with me in late 1998, she said. "He did not say, 'keep it safe.' He said, 'If anyone comes asking the right-wrong questions, give it to them only after you decide whether they can survive learning they are inside the material.'" Eleanor looked at her. "Inside it?" Ruth untied the ribbon. "That was his phrase. I disliked it then. I dislike it more now." Inside the portfolio were photocopies, 2 small cassette transcripts, handwritten notes, and a manila envelope brittle with age. Ruth slid one document free and turned it toward Eleanor. It was a typed witness summary, unsigned in the conventional sense, though initials at the bottom suggested it had been recorded and reformatted by Hanno. The heading read, "Former Municipal Utility Engineer, Leipzig Sector North, Informal Interview, March 1998. Elena bent over it. The transcript described night inspections during the winter of 1988 to 89, after residents complained that unplugging aerial cables did nothing to stop a late evening signal on certain television sets. According to the witness, small unauthorized modifications had been found inside 2 local substations. Additions integrated so precisely into the switching cabinets that they appeared factory installed unless one knew original layouts by memory. The witness believed the modifications were temporary and had been removed before official review. One answer in particular had been underlined twice by Hanno. Question: what kind of signal behavior did residents report? Answer: most described a children's broadcast or puppet program. That was the odd part. They all used almost the same image language, but not in the same order. It was as if the memory arrived pre-arranged and people filled in the edges afterward. Elena read the line again. Memory arrived pre-arranged. Ruth watched her without interruption. "Keep going," she said. The next document was a schematic reproduction Hanno had annotated by hand. It showed a simplified model of how audio frequency content might be carried through localized power infrastructure and interact with older cathode ray televisions under very specific conditions of grounding, line noise, and internal component variance. Elena recognized just enough of the technical language to understand the broad claim. This had never been an alternative to broadcasting. It had been parasitic on broadcasting, piggybacking on the television's authority while arriving through the electrical system beneath it. A broadcast-shaped intrusion. She sat back slowly. Until now, part of her had clung, even after the conduction files, even after her father's note, to the idea that the program itself had existed somewhere in a distorted or fragmented form. A misfiled children's show, a partial late-night transmission repurposed for some experimental signal test, something with images, studio staff, a tape source, however grotesque its use had become. But the documents on Ruth's table leaned toward a more disturbing possibility. The show may not have existed in any conventional production sense at all. The puppet, then, would not be the remains of a television program. It would be a theatrical artifact built to stabilize or reinforce what listeners believed they had seen, a prop supporting a memory already inserted. Elena looked up. "My God." Ruth gave a humorless nod. Yes, that was roughly Hanno's conclusion. She drew the manila envelope from the portfolio and opened it with care. "Here. This is the piece that broke him, or clarified him. I'm not sure which." Inside was a transcript of an interview Hanno had conducted with a retired psychologist formerly attached to a late-state research program with the bland title Cognitive Environmental Adaptation Working Group. The name was redacted in places, probably by Hanno rather than any institution. Large sections were paraphrased, but the surviving lines were enough. Question: was the puppet program real? Answer: that depends what you mean by real. The image anchor was real. The domestic response was real. The recollection was real. People are too romantic about the order in which those things must occur. Question: was there a filmed broadcast? Answer: not in the way you are imagining. Not for most subjects. Elena felt the floor of her understanding tilt. Ruth pointed to another line, one Hanno had marked in thick black pencil. Children generate consensus efficiently when fright is paired with incomplete source imagery. The household screen need not show a coherent scene if the environment provides authority and the stimulus provides a stable symbolic face. The words landed with the clean force of an instrument rather than an idea. Not a puppet show then, not primarily. A structured auditory intrusion carried into selected homes, accompanied by unstable visual cues, perhaps fragments, flashes, implied forms, just enough to let children and tired adults attach the experience to the television and later reconstruct it together as a program. A synthetic collective memory assembled from fear, suggestion, and the ordinary trust people placed in the glowing screen at the center of domestic life. Eleanor could hear her own pulse. The tower had never been the contradiction that invalidated the phenomenon. It was one of the phenomenon's after effects. A decoy memory anchor. The realization came not as triumph, but as collapse. For several days, she had pursued the mystery as an archivist does, assembling fragments around a presumed object, a missing broadcast, a banned program, a hidden signal source, something recoverable in the old categories. Now the categories themselves were failing. There may never have been a program to recover, only a method, a delivery system. And if that was true, then her own childhood memory, curtains, heater, glow, puppet face, was not the last residue of a lost transmission. It was the evidence of successful implantation shaped afterward by culture, family, rumor, and fear. She felt suddenly, almost nauseatingly, uncertain of the furniture of her own mind. Ruth rose without comment, went to the kitchen, and returned with water. Elena drank because her hand was shaking. Did Hanno prove it? She asked at last. He proved enough to stop sleeping. Ruth sat down again. He also found something worse. From the folder's back section, she drew a folded notepaper and handed it across. It was Hanno's handwriting this time, jagged but legible. If source architecture was never dismantled, the work may not be finished. Falk inherited more than documents. He inherited intention. Below that, an address in Leipzig had been written, then crossed out. Under it, another, former utilities training compound, Mocken. Asked for sub-level plans, flood-sealed access. If intact, this is where the originating chamber survived. Elena stared at the page. He thought the bunker still existed. Yes. And that Leon Falk was trying to continue the research. Ruth's face hardened. Hanno thought the son had turned the father's work into a private religion, not political anymore, personal, completion for its own sake. He believed the first experiments had failed, not because they were immoral, but because the infrastructure of the era was too weak, the environment too fragmented. After the 90s, with digital networks expanding, Hanno became convinced Falk was waiting for a new delivery architecture. The room seemed to lose warmth. Elena saw suddenly, with terrible clarity, why the anonymous buyers in the region might be destroying old CRT televisions and VHS players. Not as collectors, not out of nostalgia, as containment, or as cleanup. Removing legacy devices still capable of demonstrating how the original system behaved. Erasing the hardware that could connect present investigations to past mechanisms. At the same instant, another thought struck her. If the original memory event relied on old domestic televisions and electrical line conditions, then the puppet image on her office flat screen had not been part of the old system at all. It was new. Adapted, meaning someone active in the present had both motive and technical reach. She set down the glass too hard. Water sloshed onto the table. Ruth looked at her steadily. You understand now why I insisted on no recording devices. Elena nodded once. Ruth opened the final item in the portfolio, a narrow envelope containing a keycard, browned at the edges, and a hand-drawn map on graph paper. The map showed a fenced industrial yard in Leipzig, a disused training building, and an access route marked not through the main structure, but around its rear service foundation. A note beside a cross-hatched rectangle read, "Flood-sealed stair, secondary entrance after 1989. If still closed, conduit trench may remain passable." Hanno left that after his last trip to Leipzig, Ruth said. He came back soaked, half delirious, and more frightened than I had ever seen him. He said he got close, but not all the way in. He said the place had been changed below ground, sealed in one direction, opened in another. 3 days later, he mailed copies of half his notes to different people. Then he vanished from any pattern I could follow, not dead officially, not alive in any useful way either. Eleanor folded the map carefully. The answer should have been obvious now. Report everything. Hand it to federal authorities. Stop. Let institutions, for all their evasions, absorb the burden. But Hallberg's caution, the erased files, the anonymous internal message, and the vanished requester from 1997 had already taught her what institutions did when narratives threatened their structural comfort. They proceduralized them until motion ceased. And worse, if Leon Falk was active now, if the system had already been modernized enough to breach her office monitor. Delay was no longer neutral. Ruth watched the decision settle into Eleanor before Eleanor fully named it herself. "You're going to Leipzig," Ruth said. It was not a question. Elena looked down at the map. "Yes." "Then take this too." Ruth reached into the portfolio and withdrew a final folded page. It was a list of words and phrases in Hanno's hand, some crossed out, some circled. Most made little sense in isolation. At the bottom he had written a single instruction. If auditory phenomena begin, do not answer in language. Count backward with mechanical tasks. Do not complete the voice's pattern. Elena read it twice. Did that happen to him? Ruth's expression turned distant. He said the danger was not hearing things. The danger was hearing something that seemed to know which memory it had used to enter you. When Eleanor finally stood to leave, Ruth retrieved the phone from the biscuit tin and handed it back without switching it on. In the hallway, before unlocking the door, she said quietly, "There is one more thing. Hanno wrote your first name in one margin years before I ever knew who you were. only once. Next to a note about residential coverage maps, Eleanor felt every muscle in her body go still. Why? Ruth opened the door a crack and looked past her into the dim corridor. Because, she said, your childhood address appears on a conduction roster marked responsive household. And beside it someone wrote in a different hand, Subject E, retained trace after parental interruption. The corridor outside seemed suddenly too narrow for breathing. Responsive household, Subject E, retained trace. Eleanor turned back, but Ruth had already stepped away from the threshold. Her final words came from the half-lit sitting room beyond. Whatever you thought you were investigating, she said, you weren't looking at a mystery from outside. You were looking at the experiment from inside it. Leipzig greeted her with freezing rain and the color of old paper. Elena arrived just before noon the next day on an intercity train, whose windows had fogged so completely during the final stretch that the city seemed to materialize only in fragments. Signal masts, graffiti dark retaining walls, the pale backs of apartment blocks. Then suddenly, the station roof opening above her like an iron ribcage from another century. She stepped onto the platform, carrying one small overnight bag, Ruth Berlich's hand-drawn map, Hanno's copied notes, and the growing awareness that every ordinary movement now felt compromised by private meaning. She had not told the archive where she was going. At 7 that morning, she had sent Hellberg a neutral message stating that she was unwell and would remain unreachable for the day. It was the kind of lie institutions recognized and preferred because it allowed everyone to keep their language intact. Illness, personal matter, temporary leave. She had left out Leipzig, the bunker, and the fact that she no longer trusted the boundary between professional crisis and her own biography. That omission had a cost. By the time the train pulled out of Berlin, her phone already held 2 missed calls from the archive, one from IT security, and a short text from Jewel. Are you okay? People are saying this could become public. Public, the word might once have mattered most. Reputation, position, credibility. Elena had spent 2 decades building her authority patiently, brick by brick, until she was the kind of woman whose judgment entered meetings before she did. If the archive system's incident widened into an inquiry, if her unsanctioned access to K-44 material surfaced, if Hellberg chose to frame her conduct as compromised by personal involvement, much of that could collapse quickly. Institutions rarely admitted uncertainty by blaming systems. They blamed people. She turned the phone off. In the station concourse, the air smelled of wet coats, diesel residue, and bakery sugar. Travelers dragged luggage past holiday posters and temporary retail displays. The public address system issued delays in a voice so smooth it seemed designed to reassure no one. Eleanor stood near a pillar and let the crowd move around her while she oriented herself internally. This was the city of her childhood, but not the city she had left. Reunification had altered its surfaces, then capitalism had altered them again. But some spaces still carried the old geometry. Broad roads that felt slightly overplanned, district housing blocks with facades washed into undecided beige, administrative buildings whose windows remained too narrow, too careful. The Old East did not survive as scenery. It survived as pressure in the arrangement of space. She took a tram northward, then another, moving through neighborhoods where modern cafes stood beside late GDR concrete and newly insulated apartment blocks faced courtyards that still seemed built for supervision. She watched the city through rain-streaked glass and tried not to think about responsive household, subject E, retained trace after parental interruption. It was the kind of phrase that could destroy proportion if allowed too much room in the mind. A notation in a file, perhaps one among dozens. Perhaps a routine observation in some failed program that barely understood the humans it labeled. Yet the words had already done their work. They had shifted Elena's relation to her own life. She was no longer only the investigator, no longer only the archivist assembling someone else's vanished system. She was a surviving instance of it. That should have made her stop. Instead, it narrowed the question from whether to continue to how far she could go before whatever remained of the system recognized her movement and reacted. The former utilities training compound stood in Möcken, behind a line of scrub trees and an industrial fence patched with newer chain links. From the tram stop, it appeared at first glance exactly what official neglect preferred: an obsolete low-rise complex awaiting demolition or speculative redevelopment, a weather-streaked administration wing, a yard sunk in puddles, outbuildings with boarded windows. The sign at the road, half removed, advertised an environmental remediation contractor that no longer seemed present. No one looking quickly would imagine hidden broadcast histories, acoustic experiments, or sublevels beneath the soaked concrete. Elena did not approach immediately. She found a small cafe 2 streets away, took a table by the back window, and ordered coffee she barely touched. From her bag, she drew Ruth's map and Hanno's note sheet. The route he had sketched ran behind the main building, past what had once been a service loading area, then along the foundation line to a flood-sealed stair. If that entrance remained inaccessible, a conduit trench near the rear retaining wall might still connect to lower infrastructure. Ask caretaker about sub-level access after flood sealing. She looked up and scanned the street. No obvious surveillance, no repeated faces, but the absence of visible attention no longer reassured her. She had seen too much already accomplished quietly. At 1:30, she left the cafe and circled the compound on foot. The fence line sagged in one section where brambles had overgrown the base. Beyond it, the yard lay empty except for pallets, a rusted skip, and rainwater shining in depressions in the concrete. On the far side stood a maintenance shed with a light on inside. Caretaker, or security. Elena hesitated only once before slipping through the bramble gap in the fence. Wet branches caught at her coat. The yard smelled of mud, old oil, and rain striking dust into paste. As she crossed toward the shed, the door opened and a man stepped out carrying a bucket. He was perhaps 65, heavy-set, in a faded work jacket and knit cap. He stopped when he saw her and looked neither surprised nor welcoming. "You're not from the contractor," he said. "No. Then you're either lost or lying." Elena held his gaze. "I'm looking for flood-sealed sub-level access beneath the old training block." The bucket remained in his hand, but his posture altered. "That's a peculiar sentence to bring onto private property. I was told to ask the caretaker." He set the bucket down very carefully. Rain ticked on the shed roof between them. "Who told you that?" She could have said Hanno's name immediately. Instead, she said, "A man who came here years ago and left with less certainty than he arrived." For the first time, the man's expression betrayed recognition, not of her, of the pattern. "The historian," he said. "Nubam, the historian," he said. "Yes." He spat rainwater from his lip and glanced toward the training block as though it were listening. He wasn't a historian by the end. A pause. "You should leave." Did he find the sublevel? The caretaker gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Fine? Maybe. Understand? No. No one understands places like that. They only disturb them." Elena stepped closer. "I need to know whether it's still accessible." Need is a dramatic word. So is inherited experiment. That landed. He looked at her more sharply now, taking in her age, her accent, the disciplined way she stood even in the rain. "Who are you?" "Someone who grew up in Sector North." The answer changed something. Not trust, but category. He lowered his voice. "They sealed the main stair after a flood in the 90s, or said they did. Water came up through the lower conduit rooms, and some contractor refused to continue after hearing voices in the ducts. That part became a joke around here. Men like making jokes when they're afraid of sounding foolish." He rubbed his mouth with the back of his hand. "There's still a trench access behind the retaining wall, usually locked. Sometimes not. Sometimes. Depends who's been using it." Elena felt the words land physically. "Recently." He did not answer at once. Instead, he bent, lifted the bucket again, and took 2 steps toward the shed before turning back. "2 nights ago, I found fresh tire tracks by the service yard. No official vehicles, no paperwork, and one of the old generator housings that hasn't had power in years was warm to the touch. The rain seemed suddenly colder." "Did you report it?" Elena asked. The man gave her a look so level it almost embarrassed her. "To whom?" He jerked his head toward the rear of the compound, behind the retaining wall, near the drainage grating, if you're determined to ruin your day. "You're not coming. I made my choices years ago." his face shut down. "And if you have any sense, you'll make yours before dark." The trench was half concealed behind broken pallets and a strip of corrugated metal. Elena found it exactly where the map suggested, running low along the rear wall of the training block before descending toward a concrete access collar half covered in moss and leaves. A steel hatch stood there, not fully closed, not locked. She crouched beside it, every nerve in her body awake. The hatch smelled of wet rust. Beneath it came a faint draft carrying colder air than the yard above. And something else, something electrical and old. A hum, not imagination, not metaphor. Real. Elena straightened slowly and looked back over the compound. The caretaker had vanished into the shed. The yard stood empty under the freezing rain. Somewhere in the distance, a tram clanged faintly through traffic. She should have called someone then. Police, federal authorities, even Hallberg. If only to force responsibility back up into the institutional world. Instead, she found herself thinking of her mother standing in the kitchen doorway, listening. Of her father taping a note inside the panel. Of Hanno Berlich mailing fragments of proof to anyone stubborn enough to keep them. Of the erased files in Berlin. Of the phrase "not a program," a delivery system. Of Subject E. And with that came the recognition that silence had already begun damaging her life in ways no official inquiry could repair. Her work account suspended, her files wiped, her reputation tilting toward suspicion, her home altered. Her own memory called into question by evidence bearing her initial. There was no easy way back now. She opened the hatch. A narrow concrete shaft descended into darkness, fitted with an iron ladder slick from condensation. The hum below deepened by one thin degree, like a machine becoming aware of load. Elena reached into her coat for the small torch she had packed that morning. At that exact moment, her phone, still switched off in her bag, began to vibrate. The vibration continued in short, hard bursts from inside her bag, impossibly insistent for a device she knew she had switched off on the train. For a moment, Elena remained crouched beside the open hatch, one hand gripping the wet rim of the access collar, the other already inside the satchel searching by touch. Rain struck the concrete around her in cold, irregular taps. The hum below the shaft remained steady, a low mechanical presence rising from the dark like pressure from deep water. Her fingers closed around the phone. The screen was black. Still it vibrated. She pulled it free and stared at it in disbelief. No boot sequence, no notification light, no visible sign of power. Yet in her hand, the device shuddered twice more, then fell still. The silence that followed felt staged. Elena looked back toward the maintenance shed. No one in sight. The yard remained abandoned, flattened by rain. She pressed the side button on the phone. Nothing. She held it longer. Still nothing, a dead instrument behaving like a message. Her first impulse was to drop it back into the bag and continue downward before fear could clot itself into reason. But another instinct, older and more disciplined, held her in place. Systems did not merely act, they left traces. If the present crisis had taught her anything, it was that symbolic intimidation often arrived wrapped around technical method. She slipped the phone into the outer pocket of her coat and turned on the torch. The beam struck the ladder rungs, the damp inner wall of the shaft, and finally the concrete floor perhaps 4 meters below. Water glistened there in shallow standing pools. A cable conduit ran along one side, newer than the surrounding structure. Black sheathed and professionally fixed with brackets that had not been rusting long enough to belong to the original site. Someone had been modernizing underground. That fact steadied her more than it frightened her. Old mysteries could always be pushed toward myth. New cable brackets could not. Eleanor swung one leg over the opening and began to descend. The ladder was slick but sound. By the 3rd rung, the rain noise above had already dulled. By the 6th, it was replaced by the enclosed acoustics of concrete and distant machinery. Her torch beam shook slightly with each movement, tracing mineral streaks on the shaft wall and catching once on old stenciled markings nearly erased by damp. At the bottom, she stepped into a corridor scarcely wider than her shoulders. The air was colder than outside and carried that unmistakable mixed smell of subterranean technical spaces. Water, dust, oil, decaying insulation, metal heated and reheated over years. The corridor ran in two directions. To the left, darkness. To the right, a faint suggestion of amber light reflected in a bend of the wall. She listened. The hum was stronger now, but no longer singular. Beneath it, she could distinguish minute fluctuations, rising and falling in regular intervals, as if multiple systems were balancing load across connected lines. There was also another sound, subtler and more disturbing, the slight high click of relays or switches engaging and disengaging somewhere beyond the bend. Not abandoned then, operational. Elena moved right. The corridor opened after 10 meters into an older service passage reinforced with brutal concrete ribs. Rusted pipework crossed the ceiling. Along the wall ran faded painted arrows and room numbers, some original, some newer. Hanno's sequence returned to her at once. 6-2-1940, 3-11-28. She took out Ruth's map and compared angles, trying to align his hand-drawn route with the reality before her. The difficulty lay in time. Nothing underground remained exactly as its first builders imagined. Flood ceiling, later retrofits, removed doors, rerouted conduits. Each decade had written a thin correction over the last. Yet enough structural logic survived that she could feel the place thinking in old state planning language. Service node, distribution corridor, control chamber. Below-ground architecture had its own bureaucratic grammar. At the first junction, she found proof that someone had been there recently. On the floor, pressed into the dust where the damp had not fully reached, were footprints. Not many. Two distinct tread patterns. One heavy and industrial, likely boots. The other narrower, more modern. Near the wall, a discarded plastic cable tie lay beside a fresh scrape mark on the concrete. Elena crouched and touched the scrape with one gloved finger. The dust had been disturbed within hours, not days. She straightened, pulse harder now. The easier explanation would have been urban explorers, scavengers, contractors cutting illegally through old infrastructure for copper or access. But the cable conduit in the shaft, the warm generator housing the caretaker had mentioned, the file erasure in Berlin, the adapted flat-screen interference in her office, together they resisted casual intrusion as an explanation. Someone was working here with purpose. A little farther on, she reached a steel door standing ajar. The stenciled label above it had mostly flaked away, but two words were still legible. Acoustic Module. Inside, her torch revealed a chamber stripped almost bare. Hooks on one wall where equipment racks had once hung. A drain in the floor, brackets for cables. On a metal shelf near the entrance lay a warped binder swollen by moisture. Elena opened it carefully. Most pages had fused together. A few came apart just enough to read headings. Induction tolerance, repetition interval, child response variance. One water-damaged sheet held a typed table listing domestic appliance interference factors. At the bottom, in handwriting darker and sharper than the surrounding notes, was a later annotation. Legacy CRT response exceeded projection because users trusted household image source even when visual content was incomplete. Visual content incomplete. Again, the same principle. Not a coherent program, a suggestion occupying the authority of the screen. She took photographs with the small standalone camera she had brought precisely because Ruth had warned against relying on network devices. Then she moved on. The amber light grew stronger around the next bend. It came from a long room ahead where old emergency bulbs, recently replaced in some fittings, but not all, cast a weak industrial glow across rows of structures Elena at first mistook for storage tanks. Then the torch beam found glass, padded interior linings, headrest frames, and sealed cable ports, sensory chambers. There were 12 of them arranged in 2 rows. Some stood open and empty. Others remained closed, their windows opaque with residue and condensation. Thick wiring ran from the rear of each chamber into ceiling conduits, and from there toward a newer control cabinet at the far end of the room. On a side table, under a film of dust broken by recent handprints, lay manuals in typed ring binders. Neuro-linguistic response conditioning, phase delay and suggestibility, domestic audio embedding, field notes. Elena did not immediately touch them. She stood in the center of the room and let the scale of it alter her breathing. The bunker she had imagined from the old man's words and Hanno's photographs had still retained somewhere in the back of her mind, a residue of studio logic. Even stripped down, she had expected cameras, projection surfaces, puppet storage, maybe some degraded scenic equipment supporting the grotesque mythology of a vanished children's show. There was none of that. The place was not built to produce performances. It was built to shape responses. The realization completed the collapse that had begun in Ruth Berlich's apartment. The apparent explanation Elena had pursued, a lost or hidden broadcast later denied by records, was not merely incomplete. It had been useful precisely because it was incomplete. Even the internet phenomenon, the shared insistence on a bizarre puppet program from 1988, had served as a safe outer shell around something structurally more disturbing. People could argue forever about false memory, folklore, the Mandela effect, and whether a tower had or had not existed. Meanwhile, the actual mechanism remained tucked inside arguments over source identity. The original belief had been wrong in the exact way the system required. She moved to the side table and opened one of the manuals. The pages inside were a combination of technical notation and clipped conceptual language. She recognized immediately that some sections belonged to the late GDR era and others had been added later. Different paper, different typeface, different terminology shaped by post-1990 research culture. Someone had not merely preserved the site, someone had continued studying it. One inserted page bore a modern print header from the early 2010s. Across the top, typed cleanly in German, was a phrase that made Eleanor go still. Completion requires migration from household trust architecture to ambient network dependence. Below it, a paragraph proposed that the original conduction trials had been limited by infrastructural inconsistency and by the necessity of relying on analog domestic devices whose behavior varied too widely between households. Contemporary systems, by contrast, offered unified timing, distributed signal layers, and greater behavioral integration. The challenge, according to the text, was no longer entry. It was persistence. Elena turned the page. In the margin beside a section on adaptive symbolic anchors, someone had written by hand in dark ink. The puppet remains optimal because incompletion is remembered more efficiently than coherence. She closed the binder. Her throat felt tight. The machinery humming somewhere below or beyond this room was not preserving the past. It was translating it. At the far end of the chamber, a second door stood half open. Through it came the stronger pulse of current and the unmistakable glow of active monitors. Elena killed her torch and moved forward in near darkness, using the weak amber bulbs and the light spilling from the adjoining room. The next chamber had once been a control room. Most original consoles had been stripped away, but their outlines remained in the floor and walls. In their place stood modern racks, fiber junction hardware, power conditioning units, 2 portable servers, and 3 screens mounted above a work surface improvised from old steel tables. Cables looped across the floor in disciplined bundles. On one screen, a frequency analysis rolled live across a black background. On another, a network map branched outward in pale nodes. The third displayed what at first looked like corrupted video, then resolved into a slow cycling archive of puppet faces, historical photographs, reconstruction scans, variant models rotating in 3-dimensional space. Elena stopped just inside the doorway. Pieces were connecting now with cruel speed. The file wipe in Berlin, the appearance of the puppet on modern displays, the destruction of old CRT and VHS devices that could demonstrate legacy behavior, the new conduit in the shaft, the contemporary annotations in the manuals. Leon Falk, if alive and active, was not attempting to repeat his father's work exactly. He was searching for continuity across media environments, how to carry a fear-shaped symbolic anchor from the age of broadcast authority into the age of network saturation. The hidden truth was beginning to take shape, but the most important proof was still missing. Who was here now? Where was the central source? And how much of the system was already active beyond this bunker? She stepped toward the screens. On the work surface lay printed pages, some technical, some handwritten. One sheet contained a list of German cities and infrastructure references. Berlin was among them. So were Dresden, Halle, Magdeburg, Jena. Another page held logs of test pulses routed through old municipal power corridors and contemporary building management systems. A third displayed what looked disturbingly like behavioral notes from small, unsourced public incidents. Unexplained audio reports, cluster memories around children's media fragments, short-lived visual anomalies on commercial screens. Field adaptation successful only where prior cultural residue exists. That line had been circled. Elena photographed as much as she could in rapid sequence. Then she saw the cabinet. It stood against the rear wall, half concealed behind an equipment rack, older than everything else in the room, and protected by a reinforced door now hanging slightly ajar. Inside were file boxes, magnetic media canisters, and a row of folders with typed spine labels. One label, unlike the others, had been marked by hand with a black stripe. Responsive households. Her breath stopped. She crossed the room, pulled the folder free, and opened it. Inside were roster pages, address grids, coded observations, age bands, parental behavior notes, response classifications. Most entries used initials or sector references rather than full names, but enough survived to turn abstraction into injury. There, on a page clipped under Sector North, residential block code matching her childhood street, was an entry marked with blue pencil, EW. Age 7, retained trace after interruption, auditory completion probability high. Recommend deferred observation only. Elena stared at the line until the letters became difficult to separate from the page. Behind her, somewhere in the room's active machinery, a relay clicked. Then a man's voice spoke calmly out of the darkness beyond the racks. "You came farther than Berlick did." Elena did not turn immediately. The folder remained open in her hands, the page with her childhood initials lifted in the cold industrial light. Around her, the modernized control room hummed with layered current. Small cooling fans breathed from the equipment racks. Relay clicks came at measured intervals. On the screen to her left, the rotating three-dimensional puppet heads continued their slow clinical spin, as if anatomy were being studied rather than remembered. The man's voice had been steady, almost courteous. "You came farther than Berlick did." Not shouted, not surprised, spoken by someone who had expected, eventually, to address a witness standing exactly where she stood now. Elena closed the folder with deliberate care and set it on the table rather than dropping it. Only then did she turn. He stood beyond the last equipment rack, one hand resting lightly on the metal frame, as though he had been there for some time, listening before deciding to reveal himself. He was younger than she expected. Not young, but younger than the architecture of the place. Younger than the inheritance she had already begun to imagine around him. Mid-50s, perhaps. Tall, spare, dressed not like a government official or a corporate technician, but like a man who needed to pass unnoticed in public. Dark coat, charcoal sweater, work boots without logos. His hair was iron grey at the temples, cut short. His face might once have been handsome if some long internal discipline had not pared it down to severity. Nothing theatrical in him. That was the first unsettling thing. The second was his composure. No visible panic at being discovered. No clumsy attempt to deny the room around him. He seemed, if anything, mildly relieved that the conversation had finally reached its proper chamber. "Leon Falk," Eleanor said. He inclined his head once. "You've been asking for me by several routes. It seemed efficient to let one succeed." The words sent a cold line through her spine. "You erased my files. Your files were becoming vulnerable to the wrong custodians." He took a step into fuller light. His eyes were pale and tired, but very alert. "I removed copies. I did not remove what mattered. You're standing in it." Eleanor heard herself laugh once, without humor. That is an astonishingly elegant way to describe sabotage. "And you are an archivist. You understand that deletion and preservation are not always opposites." She said nothing. He looked toward the folder she had just set down. "You found the responsive household roster. Then Ruth spoke to you, and Mars, likely Brenner as well, if he was still susceptible to curiosity. You move as Berlish moved, except with greater structural patience." The mention of Hanno sharpened her voice. "What happened to him?" For the first time, something like annoyance touched Falk's face. He happened to himself. He reached the threshold that certain kinds of minds mistake for revelation, and then could no longer live outside it. A pause. He was brilliant in fragments. Berlich's tragedy was that he believed exposure and understanding were the same act. Is he alive? As far as I know, which is not far enough to comfort you. The answer, evasive and not entirely dismissive, felt worse than a lie. Eleanor let her gaze move past him toward the deeper dark beyond the control room. A service corridor ran there, descending slightly. From that direction, the hum strengthened and took on another layer she had not fully registered until now. A faint rhythmic modulation, almost like breathing translated into electrical intervals. "There's more below," and she said. Falk followed her glance. "Yes, the originating chamber. The surviving one, not the original in every sense. Nothing survives in every sense." He spoke as if conducting a seminar with a difficult colleague. "You continued the work," Elena said. "I continued the evidence. You modernized it. I prevented it from being buried under internet folklore and amateur pathology. Do you know what they call this now? Mandela effect. Shared false memory, as though the phenomenon explains itself by becoming a meme. It's obscene." His voice had not risen, but it had hardened. Eleanor stepped away from the table, keeping a careful distance between them. "You're speaking as if you corrected an injustice." "In a way, I did." The answer hung there, so calmly monstrous that for a moment she could not decide whether fury or disbelief belonged first. "Children were used," she said. "Families, entire residential blocks." "Yes," Falk replied. "Badly. Crude infrastructure, fragmentary conditioning, ideological management masquerading as science. My father and his superiors wanted a weapon against unstable populations, dissident cognitive drift, Western narrative contamination. The state was dying, and so it reached for the oldest fantasy, direct entry into perception." He moved one hand across the room, indicating the old chambers, the manuals, the cables. What they produced was historically important and technically unfinished. "That is not the same as defensible." Eleanor stared at him. "And your response to that moral distinction was to continue." "My response," he said, "was to prevent the mechanism from being reduced to ghost stories while every institution that inherited its traces refused to name what it was." There was conviction in him, but not fanatic heat. That made him more dangerous. He had built a private ethic around continuation so thoroughly that atrocity could be discussed as design failure and historical residue as unfinished architecture. "The puppet on my office screen," Eleanor said. "The humming through the reading room speakers, the wiped archive folders, those were not acts of scholarship. No, those were messages." He seemed almost regretful. "You had reached the point where administrative actors would have neutralized you before you understood enough. Hallberg is not an imaginative man, but he belongs to a lineage of protective containment. He would have delivered you into procedure until you began to doubt your own sequence of facts. I accelerated the breach." Elena felt an unpleasant jolt of recognition, because part of what he said was plausible. Institutions did bury by process. They did translate danger into review, committee language, access suspension, psychiatric suspicion if necessary. The truth in that made his larger self-justification more insidious. "You don't get to rescue me with intrusion," she said. "No," he answered, "but I may still have rescued the investigation." The room seemed to draw tighter around that word, investigation, as if he and she were merely in dispute over method. Elena took one slow breath. Why the destruction of old CRT televisions and VHS players? This time a faint, almost tired smile crossed his face. "Containment partly, preservation partly. Legacy hardware demonstrates too much too quickly to the wrong kind of observer. They see one phenomenon and build 30 lies around it. The old devices also carry residues, contamination patterns, grounding behaviors that are dangerous when distributed without context. Some were bought, some were destroyed, some were relocated. By you. By people who understand the difference between an archive and an outbreak." She almost said monster. Instead, she said, "And the people hearing voices now? Seeing anomalies on modern displays?" Falk's gaze moved to the active monitors. For the first time, his composure acquired something like genuine intensity. "That is the question, isn't it? Whether the symbolic anchor can persist after the household screen loses its monopoly of trust. Whether distributed networks, Ambient display ecology and infrastructural dependence create a broader environment than domestic television ever could. He looked back at her. Weather memory can be induced not as a single event, but as a cultural weather system. The cold inside Elena sharpened to clarity. This was no mere preservation project, no containment effort distorted by obsession. He was already testing transition. "You're reactivating it," she said. Falk did not answer. He did not need to. The hum from deeper below intensified very slightly, as if some timed process had entered a new phase. Elena's hand moved inside her coat toward the small camera in her pocket. Falk noticed and shook his head. Photographs are irrelevant now, not to the outside world. There is no outside world for this, not in the way you still imagine. Only institutions, publics, and residual subjects competing to narrate what entered them before they had language for it. He stepped aside from the rack, giving her a clear line of sight toward the corridor behind him. If you want the decisive proof, it isn't in this room. It never was. She should not have moved toward him. Every instinct trained by decades of handling hidden things told her to slow the encounter, extract, document, withdraw. But another force, older than caution now, pulled at her with terrible exactness. The originating chamber, the surviving chamber, the room beneath the room where the sequence code had once marked a locked door, and where her childhood block, her father's note, Hanno's failed approach, and Falk's present system might finally join. "Why let me see it?" she asked. He answered at once. "Because you are already implicated enough that denial would damage you more than knowledge. And because if I am wrong, I would rather be disproven by someone whose memory carries the original trace than by a ministry committee or a journalist chasing spectacle." The phrase struck her like a physical insult. Original trace. There it was again. His reduction of human experience to system vocabulary. Not even cruelly, simply completely. Elena stepped toward the corridor. Falk did not block her. He reached instead to the console and pressed 2 keys. Somewhere below, a heavy mechanism answered with a deep metallic clunk. "The lower door was sealed after the flood," he said. "I unsealed it years ago." Berlick reached the outer threshold and turned back when the first audio patterning began. That was wise of him. "And you expect me not to turn back?" "I expect nothing. Expectation corrupts observation." She gave him one brief look of pure contempt and continued past him. The descending corridor was narrower than the one above, its walls darker with old water stains. Cable bundles ran along one side, half modern, half legacy. Here and there faded stencils remained visible through mineral bloom. Sensorik, Besuch, Zulauf. The air cooled further with each step, and the hum resolved into a structured field of sound that Elena felt now in the fillings of her teeth and the bones around her ears. It was not loud, it was pervasive. At the bottom stood the door from the photograph, or rather the same frame, altered. The old steel slab remained, bearing the sequence code in chipped black numbers, but the locking assembly had been cut and replaced with a more recent mechanism now hanging open. Someone had installed a power line along the frame and stripped it again. Burn marks stained the concrete nearby. For a second, Elena saw not the door itself, but the image from the contact print, the intact puppet leaning at the wall. The sensation was so sudden that she stopped walking. "Do not trust the first image your mind offers," Falk said from behind her. He had followed at a distance, footsteps measured. "The chamber uses residue efficiently." Elena hated the fact that the warning might be useful. She took out Ruth's folded note from her pocket and glanced once at Hanno's instruction. "If auditory phenomena begin, do not answer in language. Count backward with mechanical tasks. Do not complete the voice's pattern." She slipped it back and pushed the door. It opened inward on a chamber larger than she expected and stranger than anything above. No cameras, no stage, no projection wall. Instead, the room descended in shallow concrete tiers toward a central apparatus built around an old mainframe housing whose original cabinets had been cut open and threaded with newer fiber interfaces. Around it stood transmission frames, signal conditioners, racks of storage media, and a ring of skeletal chairs fitted with obsolete headphone rigs. Along the walls were recessed alcoves containing what looked like experimental domestic installations, CRT televisions, radio sets, apartment lamps, electrical panel boards, even fragments of furniture arranged as if rooms had once been rebuilt here in pieces. A laboratory for entering the home by simulation, and above it all, suspended from a rusted rail, hung a row of puppet forms wrapped in protective plastic. Most were incomplete. One was not. The half-melted face from her office crate stared downward from within the shroud, its surviving eye catching the chamber light with a fixed, patient gleam. Elena felt the room tilt around her. This was the full shape at last, or enough of it to wound permanently. The conducted audio, the environmental conditioning, the unstable symbolic anchor, the domestic simulation rigs, the archive of responsive households, and now the modern interfaces grafted into the old core like a second nervous system. Pieces were connecting with brutal speed, but as she stepped down the first concrete tier, searching for the single decisive proof that could not be explained away as damaged memory or technical speculation, her attention snagged on something placed beside the central console, a framed photograph, not of equipment, not of the bunker, of her father, younger, thinner, standing beside two unidentified men in work coats in front of a municipal substation panel. And before Elena could fully absorb that impossible sight, Falk spoke from just behind her shoulder. "He understood more than your mother ever knew," he said quietly. "And the final path toward the truth begins with him." For a moment, Elena could not move. The framed photograph stood on the concrete ledge beside the central console as if it had been placed there not for storage, but for consultation. Her father was unmistakable even at a younger age. Same narrow shoulders, same reserved mouth, same careful posture of a man trained to stand near dangerous systems without ever appearing dramatic. He wore a dark utility coat and held a clipboard under one arm. Beside him stood two other men in work clothes, one looking toward the camera, the other toward the open panel behind them. On the back wall, half visible above the equipment, was a stenciled sector marking from municipal grid infrastructure, not a studio, not a broadcast facility, a power site. Elena heard herself inhale sharply, as if the body had decided before the mind that impact had occurred. All the pieces she had forced into place over the last days, her father's hidden note, her mother's evasions, the responsive household roster, the conducted signal model, suddenly rotated around a new and unbearable possibility. He had not merely suspected, he had been near the system itself. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin in the chamber. Falk remained a step behind her, close enough that she could feel the presence of another body in the cold. "It was in the secondary records cabinet when I reopened the lower archive. Most of the photographs had no names. This one did. Technical liaison, Sector North Utilities Integration. Your father was useful during the adaptation phase." Eleanor turned so fast that the movement almost unbalanced her. Adaptation phase? Falk did not flinch. Household conduction required cooperation from engineers who knew local grid behavior in detail. Some were briefed partially, some were not briefed honestly. Your father appears to have understood more than was intended. The anger rose so fast, it felt almost clean. "You talk about him as if he were a component." "Because in this room," Falk said, "many people were treated as components, including you. That is the structure we are standing inside. Moral outrage doesn't change its architecture." "No, but it could still decide what to destroy." Elena looked back at the photograph. Her father, whom she had remembered as cautious, private, occasionally stern in that East German way that confused emotional economy with discipline, now stood at the edge of the chamber's history like a door she had never noticed in her own life. She thought of him unplugging the television after the nighttime visit, of the hidden note in the breaker panel, of all the years he had chosen silence not as absence, but as containment. Maybe out of shame, maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe an impossible combination of the three. Falk moved past her and laid one hand on the central console as if greeting a living thing. The machinery around them responded with a deepened harmonic pulse. A bank of dormant displays along the mainframe housing shivered awake, their screens dark at first, then filling with layered system information. Waveforms, timing grids, distribution architecture, rows of historical sector codes, alongside modern network abstractions. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing you didn't already accelerate by coming here." He touched another control. A line of status lamps shifted from amber to green. The lower chamber has been in partial restoration for years. Legacy carrier models, symbolic retention studies, migration trials, but completion required one unresolved question. Elena felt her pulse pound against the bones behind her eyes. Which was? Falk looked at her then, and for the first time his composure revealed something close to obsession. Not theatrical madness, but the bright, disciplined hunger of a man who had arranged his life around finishing someone else's unfinished sentence. Whether original trace subjects retain higher synchronization under modern ambient architectures than naive populations. Whether memory seeded in childhood becomes a better conduction pathway decades later than fresh insertion ever could. Elena stared at him. Then the meaning struck with cold precision. "You didn't just let me find this," she said. "You needed me here." Falk did not deny it. The chamber seemed to contract around that fact. Every relic, every cable, every suspended puppet form above them, every file recovered and every one erased, all of it snapped into a new and uglier configuration. She had imagined herself tracked, manipulated, perhaps even lured in broad terms. But this was more intimate. He had not wanted merely a witness. He wanted a surviving variable from the original system, someone marked, measured, and still carrying what the roster called retained trace. "You used the archive breach to drive me down here," Elena said. "You were already moving in that direction. I only removed the slower exits." That is not different. It is operationally different. There it was again, the reduction of violation into method. A thin sound rose through the chamber then, almost below hearing. Not the hum of current, a voice-like tone, the beginning of patterning. Elena's hand went instinctively to her coat pocket, where Hanno's warning note rested folded against the fabric. "If auditory phenomena begin, do not answer in language. Count backward with mechanical tasks. Do not complete the voice's pattern." She took one slow step backward. Above them, one of the plastic-wrapped puppet forms rotated slightly on its suspension rail, disturbed by air movement or vibration. The half-melted face turned a fraction farther downward. Elena refused to look at it again. "You're reactivating the chamber," she said. "Reactivating is the wrong word. The chamber never entirely stopped existing. It merely lacked a coherent environment." Falk moved toward a side rack and lifted a set of old headphones, studying their frayed band with almost detached contempt before setting them aside again. "My father's generation worked through scarcity. They forced the system into weak infrastructure and confused compliance with resonance. But now every domestic space is networked, synchronized, mediated. Screens are no longer furniture, they are atmosphere. He was early, not wrong, early." The voice-like tone deepened, weaving itself into the chamber hum. Elena did not answer. She began counting backwards silently in her head while forcing herself to observe the room in concrete terms. 5 monitors active, 3 green status bars at the left rack, 1 power trunk rising from the floor channel, 2 cooling vents cycling every 4 seconds. The main cable bundle, Brishimen thick black industrial, running from a rear conditioning unit into the old mainframe spine. Mechanical tasks, concrete objects. Do not complete the voice's pattern. Falk was speaking again, though the words seemed now to come through a slight acoustic haze. "Do you know why the puppet persisted? Not because it was frightening. Fright is common. It persisted because it was incomplete. The mind seals itself more tightly around what it cannot finish than around what it can. A face half seen. A sentence interrupted. A warning that never resolves into instruction. That is how memory remains available for reinforcement." The chamber lighting flickered. On one of the side displays, a series of historical footage fragments began cycling. Ordinary East German domestic interiors, documentary stills, apartment blocks, children's rooms, television cabinets, electrical substation diagrams, then suddenly, for a fraction of a second, the puppet face. Elena looked away at once. The voice tone shifted. For one hideous instant, it sounded like her mother calling from the kitchen. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood. Count backward. 17, 16, 15. 5 vents, 3 status bars, 1 main cable. You see, Falk said quietly. "It doesn't need content anymore, only resonance and inherited structure." He reached toward the control surface. Elena moved before she had fully decided to. She crossed the 2 meters between them in a single blunt rush and struck his arm away from the console. The impact was clumsy, fueled less by planning than by rejection. Falk stumbled half a step, more surprised than hurt. One of the status fields on the display spiked red, then restabilized. "Don't touch me," he said, and for the first time anger cracked through his voice. "Don't touch anything," Elena shot back. He caught her wrist. His grip was strong, colder than she expected. The chamber hum surged sharply at the same instant, and a flood of sound rolled through the room. Not loud, but structured, intimate, invasive. It arrived as if the concrete itself had leaned close. A child's whisper, then another. Then the low counting voice from the VHS tape, emerging beneath them both. 6, 2, 19, 40. Eleanor's body reacted before thought. Her free hand snatched at the edge of the console for balance. Falk, still gripping her wrist, seemed equally jolted. Not by the sound itself, but by some parameter crossing unexpectedly. He looked at the monitor to his right, and she saw genuine alarm flash there. "No," he muttered, "too fast." The side screens began cycling images at irregular speeds. Apartment interiors, power maps, puppet scans, then faces blurred, then sharper. Children? No. Adults remembering themselves as children, composite reconstructions, her own building block, her own street. A corridor that looked like her childhood school. Another monitor flared into static, and inside the static, something moved with the moist, impossible texture of a memory pretending to be video. The chamber was not just turning on, it was using her. That truth landed with physical force. Her presence, the retained trace, was not passive confirmation. It was an activation condition. Some convergence between original subject exposure and present signal architecture had accelerated the system beyond Falk's measured intention. He released her wrist and lunged for the console, fingers flying across switches and keys. "What did you route into this?" Eleanor shouted. "Nothing that should have produced this amplitude." His calm was gone now, stripped down to technical urgency. "The synchronization is exceeding model," the counting voice continued, joined now by the hum of electrical grids and a whisper so low it felt as if it were forming directly against the bones of her inner ear. "Do not remember me with the lights on." Eleanor shut her eyes. Too late. The sentence was already there, not heard from the room, heard from somewhere older inside her. She forced herself into motion, away from the screens, away from the rotating puppet forms overhead, away from Falk and his console. Across the chamber, she saw it then. The main power feed entering from the rear wall through a thick armored cable and descending into a breaker assembly bolted to the original mainframe backbone. It was uglier than the rest of the modernization, industrial, recent, functional. A crude artery feeding a delicate infection. If the system could still be stopped physically, it would be there. But between her and the feed stood the central apparatus and Falk, who had already turned and seen where she was looking. "Don't," he said. His voice cut through the acoustic haze with startling clarity. "You have no idea what will happen if you sever it under load." "Neither do you," Eleanor answered. She moved left. He moved to intercept. The sound in the chamber intensified, no longer merely whispering, but layering itself into recognizable fragments of private life. Her father's cough from the hallway when he came home late. The clink of dishes from her mother's kitchen. The tiny click of a CRT warming before the screen fully bloomed. It was not hallucination in the childish sense. It was targeted reconstruction, built from residue, records, and whatever the retained trace in her still provided. Falk reached her at the base of the mainframe tier. She drove her shoulder into him with more force than grace. He lost balance on the damp concrete and struck the edge of a chair frame hard enough to curse. One of the obsolete headphone rigs toppled and shattered on the floor. Eleanor seized the moment and climbed the final step toward the rear wall. The breaker housing was protected by a steel latch and a maintenance lock already half disengaged, as if Falk had been adjusting it earlier. She yanked it open. Inside, thick insulated lines pulsed faintly under indicator lamps. Heat breathed from the compartment. Behind her, Falk had regained his footing. "Elena," he shouted, not coldly now, but with something perilously close to fear. "If you do this now, the evidence burns with it." Her hand froze for half a second on the main disconnect handle, and there it was. The cost. Not an abstract one. The decisive proof she had come for surrounded her. Rosters, manuals, adaptive notes, transmission architecture, modern logs. Perhaps enough here to devastate public trust for a generation and force open what institutions had entombed under myth. If she cut power under load, the chamber might die, but the evidence might die with it. Reveal the truth and wound the living. Destroy the truth and let the wound remain buried. Her moral choice at last stood inside a steel box humming against her palm. Behind her, the chamber gave a shrill electrical cry. One of the screens exploded outward in a burst of sparks. Falk flinched. Overhead, the suspended puppet rail began to jerk violently, plastic shrouds twisting in the failing air currents like bodies trying to turn. The system was outrunning him. Elena thought of children in lit windows across East Germany in the winter of 1988. Of her mother listening from the kitchen. Of her father hiding one final sentence behind the breakers because some truths, if left intact, might keep conducting through whatever came next. Then she pulled the handle. The chamber went black so completely that for one impossible second, Eleanor thought she had gone blind. Then the darkness tore open with light. Not steady light, not illumination. Violent electrical after-images bursting across the room from overloaded capacitors and dying screens. Sparks spat from the rear rack in white-blue arcs. Somewhere behind her, a transformer unit gave a sound like an animal choking on metal, and the hum that had filled the bunker for decades rose into a shriek so thin and piercing it seemed to bypass hearing and strike directly at the spine. Eleanor staggered backward from the breaker housing, one arm thrown across her face. The disconnect handle, half melted at the grip, snapped downward under its own weight with a cracking report. Heat surged out of the open compartment. The smell of ozone and burning insulation flooded the chamber so fast it turned breathing into labor. Below her, Falk shouted something she could not make out. The old mainframe spine was still live in fragments. That was the first thing her archivist's mind grasped through the chaos. She had severed the primary feed, but residual charge and secondary power storage were discharging unpredictably through old and new systems at once. It was not a clean death. It was a convulsion. One of the suspended puppet rails gave way overhead with a tearing clang. Wrapped forms crashed against the concrete tiers and split their plastic sheaths open. A half-finished face rolled across the floor and came to rest against the leg of a metal chair, staring upward with blank eye sockets. The chamber lights flashed once more in staggered sequence. And in that strobe-like pulse, Elena saw everything at once. Falk lunging for a side console, trying to preserve something. Screens vomiting static and fragments of apartment interiors. The framed photograph of her father toppling from the ledge and skidding across wet concrete. A file box near the central apparatus spilling open, roster pages and annotated charts lifting in a heated draft like pale birds beginning to burn at the edges. Then darkness again. Not total this time. Fire had found the cable insulation. A line of orange crawled along the rear conduit and disappeared behind the mainframe housing. Plastic popped. A vent coughed black smoke. Somewhere deeper in the lower rooms, another system woke only long enough to die badly, sending a tremor through the floor beneath Elena's boots. "You idiot!" Falk's voice came through the dark, raw now, stripped of all its measured control. "Do you understand what you've done?" Elena coughed so hard the next breath scraped. "Yes." The answer surprised her by being true. Not every consequence, not every cost, but the essential shape of it, yes. She had chosen destruction over continuity. Not because destruction was pure, nor because it guaranteed safety, but because she had finally recognized that this room was not an archive waiting for lawful interpretation. It was an active wound trying to become infrastructure again. Another explosion cracked from the control room above. Emergency lighting flickered into life along one wall. Dim red strips fed by an independent circuit. In that low blood-colored glow, the chamber looked even less human than before. Smoke thickened overhead. Falk stood near the central console, one sleeve scorched, his face transformed by fury and disbelief. Between them, scattered across the concrete, burned the proof. File pages curled into black petals. Modern logs blistered at the corners. A binder ring glowed briefly before darkening. The responsive household folder had slid open where Elena dropped it earlier. One page was already burning through the middle, her childhood initials vanishing first in a bright orange hole. A betrayal, she thought suddenly. Not his, not even her father's, though there might be plenty of that in the history. Her own. Because some part of her, some disciplined, professional, archive-trained core, had come here believing she could rescue truth intact from the machine that generated it. That part had imagined boxes, evidence bags, custody chains, testimony, exposure. It had believed in the old moral architecture of revelation. Find the proof, bring it to light, trust that society will know what to do with it. Now the proof was burning in front of her, and she was the one who had chosen the flame. The grief of that landed hard and privately, almost beneath thought. Falk saw it on her face and mistook it for weakness. He moved toward the side table where a hard-shell transit case stood half open. Elena saw his intention a split second before he reached it. Backup media, portable drives, something small enough to carry out. Enough to continue. She launched herself down the concrete tier and hit the table edge with both hands. The transit case slid, tipped, and fell into the spreading fire at the base of the rack. Falk caught her shoulder and drove her sideways into a chair frame. Pain flashed hot through her upper arm. She twisted, striking at him blindly. He was stronger than she expected, but panic had entered him now, and panic is rarely elegant. They grappled in smoke and red light among falling plastic and dead equipment. He shoved her back. She grabbed the sleeve of his coat and dragged him off balance. The framed photograph underfoot shattered with a dry crack as one of them stepped on it. He swore and tried to wrench free. "You think fire purifies this?" he said, coughing between words. "It only hands victory back to the institutions that buried it the first time." Eleanor held on. "No, it denies victory to you." For the first time since she had met him, his face showed something nakedly human. Despair. Not for the children of 1988. Not for the frightened adults. Not for the ruined witnesses. Not for Hanno Berlich or the erased records or the shape of history itself. Despair for incompletion, for a work he had inherited so completely it had become his only language for meaning. That was his emotional revelation, and it changed him in Elena's eyes more than any confession could have. Leon Falk was not merely the son of the lead scientist. He was the final subject of the original experiment, the child who had mistaken system for inheritance, method for intimacy, continuation for purpose. The chamber ceiling groaned. Both of them heard it. A spray of concrete dust fell from the rail above. In the control room beyond, a rack toppled and sent a new plume of sparks across the doorway. The fire had reached more than cable jackets now. It was inside the walls, inside the patched layers where old insulation and new fiber sat too close together. Falk released her abruptly and turned toward the deeper rear alcove where another exit might once have been. There was none now, only a sealed concrete service cut and a lattice of burned conduit. He stopped, seeing the truth too late, then looked back toward the corridor by which they had entered. The only way out. Smoke thickened in violent folds, driven low by failing ventilation. Eleanor dropped to one knee, coughing, eyes streaming. Through the blur, she saw something on the floor near the central console. A metal document case, scorched but not yet burning, its latch sprung open. Inside lay a compact stack of papers, protected by inner sleeves, perhaps because someone had intended them for transport. She crawled to it. Falk saw that too and lunged. Their hands reached the case almost together. Elena caught one sleeve and tore it free. Falk seized the rest. The paper ripped between them. Half remaining in her grip, half disappearing with him into smoke and red glare. She looked down. What she held was not a roster or a technical chart, but a signed memorandum on late-state letterhead, one of the few documents in the room that could tie speculation to explicit administrative intent. The bottom portion was missing, but enough remained to read the heading and first paragraph. Pilot domestic conduction trial authorized for memory persistence and post-event source reassignment analysis. Source reassignment. There it was in official language. The tower as decoy memory anchor, the false source built into the experiment by design. A decisive piece, though not the whole of one. A cost-paid fragment. Falk saw what remained in her hand and made a sound that was neither anger nor fear this time, but loss. Then a section of burning plastic dropped from the suspended rail between them and sent a sheet of fire across the floor. He stumbled back. Eleanor used the moment to rise, clutching the scorched memorandum to her chest inside her coat. "Elena," he shouted over the roar, "listen to me. If you leave with only fragments, they will turn this into madness. They'll pathologize the witnesses. They'll call it stress, contamination, folklore. They always do." She backed toward the corridor. "Maybe. Then help me preserve the rest." The plea sounded grotesque in the burning room. Help me preserve the machine that made the wound. But there was something in it more dangerous than absurdity. A final temptation. The argument that partial truth harms, that one more compromise is necessary, that one must keep the mechanism alive to prove it existed. Every institution of abuse eventually invents that sentence. Elena shook her head once. The strongest opposition did not come from him then. It came from inside her own profession, her own habits, her own lifelong faith that no evidence should be surrendered to flame if there remained any chance of recovery. To walk away while archives died violated everything she had built herself around. Yet what burned here was not just evidence, it was active capacity. She turned and ran for the corridor. Behind her, Falk shouted something else, but the chamber answered louder. A pulse of sound rolled outward from the mainframe core as it catastrophically failed. For an instant, the bunker was filled with voices, not one, not many, but layers, like 1,000 remembered rooms speaking through each other. Kitchens, hallways, television hiss, children whispering, electrical hum beneath domestic life. And threaded through it all, the puppet's low, impossible murmur, no longer warning, no longer counting, only trying to remain. Elena did not turn back. She climbed the corridor by touch and failing red strips, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth. Smoke chased her. Somewhere behind, metal gave way with a sound like collapsing shelves in a library the size of a cathedral. Halfway up, she passed Falk. He had made it out of the chamber, but not far beyond. One leg dragged slightly, his face blackened at one side, eyes streaming. He was still carrying something small and dark in one hand, a portable drive or media block, she could not tell. Their gazes met for one brutal second in the smoke. He looked less like a scientist then than a man who had spent his life guarding a dead inheritance only to watch it choose fire over him. "It will survive you," he rasped. Elena did not answer. Maybe he meant the idea, maybe the residual traces in people like her, maybe the cultural weather he had hoped to complete, maybe only obsession itself. She kept climbing. At the shaft ladder, the smoke thickened so badly she nearly missed the first rung. Her gloves slipped once on the wet iron. She forced herself upward, one rung, then another, lungs seizing, eyes blind with water. Above her, the hatch stood open to rain and lead grey daylight so distant it looked unreal. When she pulled herself out into the trench, freezing rain struck her face with almost holy violence. She rolled onto soaked concrete and lay there coughing blackness into the open air, while somewhere beneath the yard, the bunker convulsed through its death. Then came the final blast. Not huge, not cinematic. A contained subterranean concussion that lifted the ground under her shoulders and sent a muffled thud through the training compound. Windows in the upper block shattered inward. A plume of dark smoke erupted from a rear vent stack and then from the trench itself. The hatch cover slammed half shut with a metallic scream. Elena pushed herself to her knees. The caretaker was running toward her from the shed, shouting words she could not yet pass over the ringing in her ears. Somewhere farther off, alarms had begun. Building alarms, vehicle alarms, dogs barking behind fences. She looked once toward the open hatch. Oh, no sign of Falk, no sign of the chamber. Only smoke, rain, and the knowledge that the central evidence was burning below ground beyond retrieval. Her hand went inside her coat and found the scorched half-memorandum still there, damp now from sweat and rain, but intact enough to read. A fragment, not enough for easy resolution, enough to wound every denial. As the caretaker reached her and sirens began to gather in the distance, Eleanor understood with exhausted clarity that the truth had not been cleanly exposed. It had been damaged into the world, and whether the world would receive it as history, delusion, conspiracy, or unfinished warning was a struggle only beginning. 3 weeks later, Elena Weiss stood in front of a shop window on Schönhauser Allee and realized she could no longer look at screens without first bracing herself. It was early evening. Berlin had entered that narrow winter interval when darkness arrived before the city seemed ready for it, and the glass reflected everything at once. Headlights, bicycle lamps, tram sparks, the pale motion of pedestrians in scarves and dark coats. Behind the window, flat-screen televisions glowed in neat commercial rows, each tuned to a different demonstration feed. Nature footage, sports highlights, saturated landscapes designed to prove that technology could still deliver uncomplicated pleasure. Elena saw none of it at first. She saw only light arranged in rectangles. That was enough. She lowered her gaze, adjusted the collar of her coat, and kept walking. Her resignation had become official that morning. The letter itself was brief. Chief Audiovisual Archivist Elena Weiss was stepping down for personal and medical reasons, effective immediately. The phrasing had been negotiated with legal, then softened by Hallberg in the final version so that it sounded almost gracious rather than defensive. There would be no public statement beyond the internal notice. No mention of the archive systems breach, the erased working files, the disputed regional materials, or the unauthorized trip to Leipzig. The institution had chosen the oldest survival strategy available to it: reduce the wound to personnel. Elena had signed because she understood the bargain. Remain within the building, and the machinery would close around her in review panels, managed concern, psychiatric euphemisms, procedural delay, and suggestions that fatigue had compromised her judgment. Leave, and at least the struggle over language would happen on less curated ground. It was not victory, it was air. The federal police had taken statements after the fire in Leipzig, of course. So had municipal investigators, infrastructure safety officials, and eventually a discreet office from the Historical Records Authority, whose representatives spoke in such careful grammar that every question sounded preemptively sanded smooth. Eleanor told them what she could support. She described the compound, the unauthorized cables, the lower chambers, the active equipment, the fire, the man identifying himself as Leon Falk, and the half-burned memorandum she had carried out beneath her coat. That fragment had not solved everything, but it had changed the shape of disbelief. The document, even in its damaged state, bore authentic late-state formatting, routing codes, and signatures from administrative strata that should never have appeared together if the operation had been fictional. Most importantly, the surviving text explicitly referenced domestic conduction trials, memory persistence, and source reassignment analysis. The phrase sounded dry enough to bore an ordinary reader. To the right people, it detonated. Suddenly, the old stories of the puppet program could no longer be dismissed as only folklore or internet contagion. Not confirmed in every detail, no, not purified into a simple historical claim, but anchored. Something had been designed, something had entered homes through infrastructure. Something had manipulated not merely signal, but the mind's assignment of source. That was enough to bring historians, technical analysts, former utility engineers, and a small army of cautious bureaucrats into the same room for the first time. It was also enough to frighten them. Several surviving witnesses from Leipzig and surrounding districts came forward after local coverage of the industrial fire began quietly circulating online. Not many. A dozen at first, then more. Most did not speak in the language of conspiracy. They spoke like embarrassed adults, describing a memory they had spent years treating as private nonsense. A puppet, a whisper, a sense that the television was not behaving like an ordinary television, a strange conviction about the tower that no records could support. Some remembered nothing until they read about the source reassignment line from the recovered memorandum. Then details moved. Not certainty, movement. A retired substation electrician identified one of the routing codes on the document as consistent with municipal power adaptation work from late 1988. Another former broadcasting technician testified, in language full of qualifiers, that off-record coordination between utility and media personnel had occasionally occurred under euphemistic project names during the final years of the GDR, though he claimed never to have known purpose. A psychologist who had once worked in a successor institution admitted that certain sensory conditioning materials with no clear research provenance had circulated in the 1990s under sealed internal review. The truth was not exposed cleanly. It leaked, and because it leaked through damaged fragments, partial testimonies, erased records, burned infrastructure, and witnesses who still doubted their own memory, it remained vulnerable to every force that prefers ambiguity over consequence. Newspapers split quickly into camps. Some treated the case as a buried Cold War scandal involving rogue psychological experimentation. Others called it a self-reinforcing cluster of false memories contaminated by internet myth and opportunistic interpretation of incomplete documents. Television panels invited experts who used phrases like suggestibility, urban legend persistence, infrastructure panic, symbolic contagion. Eleanor stopped watching after the second panel discussion. The problem was not disagreement. She had expected that. The problem was that so many people seemed to require total proof before they would permit even partial moral seriousness. As if the absence of complete evidence absolved everyone from recognizing the structure of what had likely happened. Some nights she thought Falk had predicted that outcome exactly. If you leave with only fragments, they will turn this into madness. He had been right about that, at least. No confirmed body was recovered from the lower levels of the Leipzig compound. The fire and subsequent structural collapse made full entry impossible for days, then hazardous for weeks. By the time specialist teams descended into what remained, the central chamber had been destroyed beyond functional recovery. Melted racks, collapsed conduit channels, waterlogged ash, shattered cabinets. A few additional documents survived in carbonized layers, enough to support the existence of coordinated conduction experiments and later unauthorized technical modifications, but not enough to produce a complete chain of command. Leon Falk himself was not found. That absence became its own argument. To some, it meant he never existed as Elena described. To others, it meant he escaped. To Elena, it meant uncertainty had chosen its preferred residence once again. She did not know which possibility disturbed her more. In the first week after the fire, she had gone to Dresden to see her mother. Marianne Weiss opened the door with the same compressed reserve she had worn through most of Elena's adult life. But age and the news had thinned her defenses. They sat in the kitchen where the radiator hissed and late rain tapped at the window. Tea cooled between them. For nearly an hour, neither woman said the sentence that mattered. At last, Elena placed the rescued photograph fragment and a copy of the memorandum extract on the table. Her mother looked first at the paper, then at the younger face of Elena's father in the photograph copy, and shut her eyes. "He told me less than he knew," she said. The admission came not dramatically, but like something long stored finally growing too heavy for the shelf. Marianne spoke in pieces. Her husband had been called into technical consultations in late 1988 by men who described the work as emergency signal shielding and domestic interference mitigation. He suspected quickly that the language was false. Later, after the nighttime complaint in their building and the visit from the two unofficial men, he became convinced the television irregularities were being fed through the grid rather than the aerial. He argued, quietly and unsuccessfully, with someone in a district office. He unplugged the set. He warned Marianne not to repeat the theory, not because he thought it untrue, but because he believed truth had become structurally unsafe. "Why didn't he tell me when I was older?" Elena asked. Her mother's answer was simple enough to hurt. Because he thought the trace remained in you, and he was afraid that naming it would strengthen it. They sat in silence after that, the old kind, but altered. It did not heal anything between them. It did something smaller and more honest. It replaced one inherited avoidance with one shared fact. That was the closest thing to family resolution Elena received. As for the public matter, she did what she could. Not television, never television. Instead, she wrote. Over 2 feverishly disciplined weeks in her apartment, surrounded by paper files, copied testimony, technical notes, Hanno Berlich's surviving materials, and her own reconstructed chronology, she drafted a long memorandum for independent historical review. It was not a manifesto. It was not a memoir. It was an evidentiary narrative, cautious where caution was required, explicit where the record allowed, and honest about what remained unprovable. She refused sensational language. She refused certainty beyond support. but she also refused the cowardly euphemisms institutions use when injury becomes politically inconvenient. She wrote that a late-state experimental system appears to have attempted domestic signal conduction through electrical infrastructure into selected households, pairing unstable audiovisual cues with memory-shaping conditions. She wrote that available evidence strongly suggests deliberate source confusion was part of the design. She wrote that later unauthorized continuation by at least one technically skilled inheritor remains plausible and may have extended experimentation into modern mediated environments. She wrote, finally, that the surviving witnesses deserved more than ridicule simply because the mechanism used against them was built to discredit their own recall. The memorandum circulated first in small academic and legal circles, then more widely. It was attacked, cited, misread, excerpted badly, defended and translated. That, too, was a form of afterlife. Elena no longer tried to control it. She had moved out of her apartment by then. Not because it was haunted. She would never use that word. But because after finding her father's note in the electrical panel, after nights of standing in the corridor, listening for a hum she could no longer prove was there, the place had lost the neutrality required for living. She rented a smaller flat in a quieter building where the wiring was newer and the walls held no known history. Even there, she unplugged devices when not in use. She kept no television. She worked now only on paper for a private research foundation willing to let her remain off-camera and mostly off-network. She slept better than in the weeks after Leipzig. Not well. Sometimes, just before waking, she still heard the low counting voice from the VHS tape. Sometimes she dreamed not of the puppet, but of rooms built to resemble homes from which all warmth had been methodically removed. Sometimes she saw her father standing in a concrete utility corridor with a clipboard in one hand and the expression he wore when trying to decide whether silence was protection or surrender. On better days, she remembered something else. The rain striking her face when she climbed out of the hatch, the shock of open air, the knowledge that even damaged truth can interrupt a machine. And yet closure remained partial, because the more careful investigators became, the more one question refused to leave the room. How much of Falk's modernization had already escaped the bunker before the fire? No one could answer that cleanly. A few unexplained incidents on public display systems were traced to ordinary software faults. Others were not. A municipal building in Halle reported a short-lived audio anomaly no engineer could replicate. 2 antique dealers in Saxony complained that someone had bought entire lots of CRT sets for cash and then vanished. A university research forum briefly hosted a paper under a false name proposing cultural persistence via incomplete symbolic anchors, before the account and draft were both removed. Each item alone meant little. Together they meant only enough to remain uncomfortable. That, perhaps, was the final shape of the matter. Not solved, not buried, not even fully exposed. Only interrupted, documented in fragments, and left to trouble the seam between history and memory where it had always wanted to live. On this evening in Berlin, Elena reached the end of the block and stopped at the traffic light. Across the street, the electronic shop window behind her cast a pale flickering reflection over the wet pavement. She should have kept walking. Instead, for reasons she would later fail to explain, she turned. The televisions inside were still cycling through demonstration footage. Mountain lakes, football highlights, impossible tropical fish in impossible color. Then, for less than a second, one screen in the lower row broke into static. Not total static. A thin, fine-grained shimmer like old cathode noise, translated badly into modern pixels. Inside it, briefly, a face formed. One collapsed eye, one cracked lens, a mouth stitched slightly wrong. Then it was gone, replaced by a bright commercial image of snow falling over a perfect alpine village. No one else on the street seemed to notice. Elena stood very still while the signal changed at the crossing and bicycles whispered past behind her. Maybe it was residue, a final nervous pattern imposed by expectation, a software glitch meeting a damaged witness halfway. Maybe the last surviving piece of Falk's work had already dispersed into systems too wide to name. Maybe the machine was dead, and memory, having once been taught the shape of its own fear, could now generate the rest without assistance. She did not know, and that uncertainty at last felt honest enough to keep. She turned away from the window and continued into the Berlin night, coat pulled close against the cold, carrying no screen, no archive badge, no institution between herself and what remained. Only the fragments she had saved, the ones she had lost, and the knowledge that some truths arrived too damaged for triumph, but still too alive to disappear. If this story stays with you, not as spectacle, but as a question about memory, power, and the fragile authority of what we think we saw, then stay with the channel. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes the most dangerous things are not the lies we are told, but the truths that survive only in pieces.